Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the Luffy Fanfics, back with the amazing fanfiction. This is the series of What if Vegapunk bring future pirate King Luffy to help Marines? Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. The last man fell. The war was over. Allies and foes watched as the match between the two greatest rivals of the age was decided. The winner, the man with the claim to one piece. Dust and the echoes of one final scream settled. The crews of the two captains waited with bated breath, gazes shaking and bodies trembling in fear, their own opponents lying at their feet. The people still among the living stood in silence to see the dawn of the new era. Blood coated the rocks, staining them red and brown. Fire and smoke licked the edge of vision, and the smell of sulfur and death clogged noses. The Marines present let their fingers grow slack, and the clanging of weapons hitting the ground cut through the silence. They knew they had failed. Minutes passed before a silhouette of a man appeared at the summit. A gust of wind blew the debris clear of his face. Tears sprung to eyes, either in horror or in relief. Some dropped to their knees, shaking in fright. For others, wide grins replaced worried scowls. They did not dare speak yet. Bright red meshed with yellow and blue, black hair and hard eyes, a straw hat firmly placed upon his head. The man took a deep breath and declared, "I am the Pirate King." A cheer rose up from his supporters. 8 people charged up the slope and embraced the man, and in turn threw him up in the air again and again in their delight. That day was to be known as the day of rebirth, or the day the sky fell. It was the day the will of D was renewed, the void century uncovered and the grand line conquered. Raftel was claimed, and the great war ended. That was also the day Monkey D. Luffy was named the second Pirate King. Blood pounded in his eardrums, threatening to burst with the slightest increase in pressure. His head was ringing, and the shouts that ripped through his torn throat silent to his own ears. One eye was swollen shut, still stinging but not the forefront of pain. He was enraged, ready to kill, to murder, and as his foe fell to his fists he hardly noticed skin being ripped apart, tattered flesh barely anchored to his bones. He felt old wounds split apart, sending white-hot pain pulsing across his back. His body was ready to implode, both mentally and physically. He was beyond his limits, well beyond his limits. It was fight or die. The final battle, the climax. If he didn't fight to the end, all he had done up until then would be for naught. Red splattered the ground like raindrops. The earth shook and the sky quaked. He was ready to die. They were all ready to die fighting for what they lived for. And even if they failed, it had all been worth it. Losing was not the same as failure. His heart stopped for a moment when they clashed again. Blood spraying and the pain intense enough to be felt by the people below. Bones broke, muscle tore, organs burst and rebuilt again and again, over and over. The eye of the storm, the final stand, blue tower fall, sky dragon roar, the beginning, the end of all things and the unstoppable will. And the truth, shouting until blood coated his throat. All remaining energy and more poured into one final blow, winding up and up and up, stretching and contorting before. He was jerked back into reality with a horrifying clear understanding of something so disturbing and so utterly earth-shattering that he was left reeling, gripping his chest. He desperately tried to suck in the ever-so-needed air. It felt like a lifetime ago he last breathed. While his body was temporarily lacking motor functions, his brain had gone into overdrive in a vain attempt to process the events just witnessed in his unconscious state. It was the most terrible thing he had seen in his life. He didn't even know things like that could happen. So why did he dream of such an awful thing? Unfortunately, no matter how hard his mind worked, he could not come to a conclusion. Luffy didn't even bother to try to comprehend the thoughts that ran through his head as he partook in that dream battle. It was too much to handle, so he forced it into the corner of his mind where anything he refused to think about lay dejectedly. It drifted from his present thoughts altogether, but he was still left with the terrifyingly crisp images and sensations that the dream had brought. When he had calmed down marginally, he heaved himself up into a sitting position and stared at his shaking hands. His fingers could hardly move, and when he looked at them he somewhat expected them to be coated in a layer of blood and dirt, and who knows what that other stuff had been. Carefully, and fearing the results, he slowly moved until he could check the rest of his body for the phantom signs of battle. There were no scars. His eyes were perfectly all right. His hair was still relatively clean and not crusted in dried blood and dirt, and there were no cuts. He once again looked down at his hands and arms. They had stretched. His arms had stretched like they were made of rubber. Giving an experimental tug at the corner of his mouth, he determined that no, he was not made of rubber. He pinned it as a distortion in the dream, as the subconscious sometimes twists reality. He swallowed thickly and ran a hand through his hair. Well, he was going to be haunted by that for the rest of his life. It was permanently burned into the back of his eyes. Shaking his head, he got off the bunk and stumbled into the bathroom he shared with 20 other people. In the dead of the night it was usually empty, but sometimes there was 1 or 2 stragglers getting a drink of water, taking a piss, or eating stolen food. He padded barefoot across the cold floor and approached the sinks. After splashing his face in freezing water a couple times, he looked up at the mirror to see a tired-looking boy just younger than him leaning against the back wall. It was his friend from the science division and not one of the generic douchebags he had to bunk with, which he was extremely grateful for. Though the boy could move like a ghost when he wanted to, Luffy could always tell when someone was near. Nobody could sneak up on Monkey D. Luffy, and that was a fact. Tomo was observant and possessed great insight. He saw the spooked eyes and trembling limbs, and shot Luffy a concerned frown. "Something up?" the boy inquired with the same dryness of a burnt cookie. The brunette raised one of his slender eyebrows at him, purple eyes still half-lidded from sleep deprivation. "No," Luffy said unsurely, eyes widening further. It was widely known that he was a terrible liar, and Toma didn't even need his great powers of understanding or a good night's rest to spot the lie. "Damn it, Luffy, you know you can't lie, so don't try. I've never seen you like this before. Tell me what's going on." Toma was also very blunt. Luffy opened his mouth to speak, and then closed it again, looking down at the dirty floor. After cultivating a suitable answer from his tired and overused mind, he once again looked up at the boy. "I can't say." "Why not?" It seemed this had succeeded in getting Toma aggravated and further screwed Luffy over. Neither of them was very touchy-feely and the conversation was getting awkwardly tense very fast. The fact that Luffy was so shaken was a sign that something was seriously wrong, and Toma was very determined to pry the answer from the other man whether he liked it or not. "I don't know. It was. I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't like a dream at all." Luffy started to panic, flailing his arms around to try to get his point across. Though he looked like an idiot, it was his eyes and the way that he was still unsteady on his feet that gave him away. "You're not making any sense. There was so much blood." He choked out in a hoarse voice, and once again images and feelings flooded through him. He dropped to his hands and knees, forced to watch as once again he fought to a brutal death. Toma was instantly at his side, watching his reactions and trying to somehow get the shell-shocked man to calm down. "I was dying. Trying to kill that person. I don't even know who he is, damn it." It was fucking insane and so clear, like a memory. It was like the world was ending. He was crying. Luffy stopped in mid-sentence when he realized that hot, thick rivers of tears were streaming down his face and dripping onto the floor. Toma looked startled and pained to see his friend in such a pitiful state. The boy frowned before getting to his feet and hauling the still sobbing Luffy to his. "Come on, let's get you something to eat. I'm sure you'll feel better with something in your stomach." That was the last they spoke of it for many months. Months later, shit, Garp swore under his breath as he slowly skimmed through the update he just received from Sengoku. According to the damned thrice piece of paper, Teach had advanced further into the New World and the casualties, pirates, marines, and civilians, were piling up. On top of that, Whitebeard was flanking left and slowly approaching a key marine base. And don't even get him started on the situation with the Revolutionary Army. It was as fucked up as it could get. And the Marys just happened to be on the losing end of the insane war. It was bad enough that there was some sort of temporary alliance between Whitebeard and Redhair, but now it seemed that Big Mom had joined forces with Blackbeard of all people. Kaido was dead already, which led to an open position in the Yonkou that Teach had immediately assumed, for the moment at least. It was pretty obvious that he was on his way towards Raftel, the legendary island at the end of the Grand Line that only Roger, Garp's ex-rival, had reached some 29 years prior. Damn it all to hell, he thought bitterly and tossed the pages onto his temporary desk. He had been sent off on a bullshit mission to the outskirts of the Grand Line to investigate a painfully obviously false rumor. Apparently a local claimed to have spotted one of Whitebeard's commanders. Sengoku just wanted him away from headquarters for a while, he was sure. He and his grandson were their two greatest pains. And the admirals and the head of the science division, Vegapunk, had been sneaking around having secret meetings with Sengoku without letting him know. Something about that was fishy. Speaking of fishy, the stench of cooked fish wafted into his cabin and the door was tossed open to reveal his grandson. The boy indeed had a hunk of fried fish in one hand, casually eating it without the aid of utensils. "Oi, Jai-chan, when are we going to get there?" Garp sighed and resisted the urge to slap his palm to his forehead. There was only so much of his grandson he could handle before he started to lose his hair. Already he was sure he was developing a bald spot on the back of his head, so much for decades of great hair. It was likely that there was a big red mark on the middle of his forehead anyway. "I've already said, about a week." "Oh no, not again." Garp mentally groaned and kicked himself in the shin. Luffy's lower lip jutted out in a pout, displaying an impressive example of the dreaded puppy eyes. The boy's pleading expression was infamous throughout headquarters as something that could melt the hearts of the most solid and cold of men. It was deadly. Garp, unfortunately, was not immune. "I'm bored though," the younger man whined, making Garp somewhat wish that he had given up trying to drill into Luffy's head as a lad that he needed to be a marine. He wished that he hadn't made the decision to take him along with him into the Grand Line to start training him from a young age. Garp silently berated himself for falling for Luffy's pout. Go find something to do. That's why I came to you. Go somewhere else. It was going to be a long mission. Hey, Toma, a young blonde woman said quietly, frowning at her dinner. It was bland and looked like a mix of green and gray goop, overall very unappetizing. Unfortunately, it was all the Marines could afford to supply to their personnel at the present time, as all the funds were being directed to the war effort. She could hardly complain about the quality of food. Yeah, the boy replied, looking up from where he'd been poking at his own dinner. It was obvious that there was something on his mind, but then again, there was something on most people's minds. What do you think Vice Admiral Garp is going to do when he finds out about the project? She said. It was common knowledge among those privy to what the project entailed that Garp had been sent off to do a mundane scouting mission just to get him off everyone's backs for a while, especially nearing its completion. Toma thought for a moment, taking the time to seriously consider it. He prodded at the massive goop with his spoon, stirring it together until it looked more like puke than food. It was good that he wasn't about to eat it in the first place. I'm not sure, but it'll probably be pretty bad. I don't even think Luffy would be able to calm him down. The woman, Rika, shivered in fear and set down her own spoon. That's a frightening thought. I know what you mean. It was a fact that Luffy seemed to be the only person in headquarters that Garp had a serious soft spot for. Even if the Vice Admiral still drove his grandson into the ground at the best of times, the man was a slave driver on his good days. Luffy was the only one able to soothe the veteran's fury when he was in one of his moods. How do you think Luffy will react? Rika asked with a faraway look. Toma laughed, throwing his head back in hysterics. He'll probably beg whoever we pull through to train him. Rika smiled softly, temporarily sated. He probably will, she said affectionately. Both she and Toma were involved in a top-secret, super hush-hush mission that could possibly turn the tides of the war. It was all Vegapunk's idea, and the entire science division had been roped into it. Rika herself was actually a doctor, but because of how short they were on staff, she had been ordered to join as well. So far, only the admirals, Sengoku, and those involved were aware of the truth behind the matter. They didn't want it to get out until after the fact so that less people would complain. They wanted a solider, a fighter, someone so powerful that no one in their world would be able to stand up to them. What they needed was the strongest man in the world. Unfortunately, the person who held that title in their world was currently on an opposing side. So when Vegapunk came prancing and shouting that he had found it, it was understandable that they were all confused. At first, they were unsure of what he was saying. Then he laid the groundwork for his theory. And then he proudly stated that he had already started the project and located a parallel world in which the strongest man was not a violent prick and would probably help them. On the other hand, it was impossible to contact them while they were in the other world, so they couldn't strike up a deal beforehand. They would have to do it the old-fashioned way, kidnap him, beg for mercy, and then convince the man to help them. All three admirals and vice admirals had been called in for backup if necessary, because, quite frankly, they were all a little worried that the strongest man wouldn't like their offer and open up a can of whoop-ass on them. They were all more than a little afraid. And it was for this reason that headquarters was monopolizing the Marines' strongest members. Don't worry about it. If we don't die, then Garp won't have anything to complain about. We'll have practically won already, Toma assured her, showing his own confidence and excitement. Yeah, she grinned in response. Are you absolutely sure that it'll pull through who we want? Sengoku was not in the mood for second guesses and less than 100%. Now that he knew it was possible, he wanted it to be true, the strongest man, fighting for them to ultimately win the war. Because, yes, at this point he was desperate and would sink to asking for help to end the insanity of a four-way war. Yes, in fact, I even know who it is. Vegapunk's mischievous grin was mocking him. Sengoku didn't fully trust the man, far too intelligent and liked to play around with them like a cat played with its food. Sure, he was an invaluable asset, but sometimes he was more trouble than he was worth. Why don't you enlighten me then? Sengoku sighed, massaging the bridge of his nose. I'm sorry, I really should not say, Vegapunk said in a sing-song voice, rocking back and forth on his heels. Well, figures. Vegapunk, just what the hell are you up to anyway? The elderly man chuckled, shaking his head. Sengoku couldn't see his eyes, and it made him nervous. They were hidden behind thick-tinted orange goggles, so they looked a little buggy. It was like interacting with a statue sometimes, a very sassy and sarcastic statue. Trust me this time, you'll thank me for it. You'd better be right. Sengoku reluctantly gave up trying to get answers from the man. They would come out on their own eventually. Vegapunk had a knack for giving people the bare minimum, subtle clues so the person would piece together everything at the end. That was just his way. Well, we're all set, just waiting for your signal. Garp won't be back until the end of the month. Sengoku muttered to himself before nodding and fixing a determined scowl on his face. He would have looked threatening if not for the stuffed seagull perched on his hat. Do it. Give biowave detectors maximum power. They're already at max, sir. Excellent. Can we track the signal? Yes, we're tracing. East blue, sir. Locking on. Vegapunk's mad grin stretched farther than his subordinates thought possible. Lights flickered and noises whizzed. A throbbing pressure emanated from a central point behind a thick panel of glass. The air was distorted and heat rolled off of it in waves. The scientists were all sweating profusely, some opting to take off their coats and roll up their sleeves. They did not have a need of professionalism at that moment. Rika watched with growing fascination. The chance to meet the world's strongest man was always a rarity, and the chance of meeting one from another world was practically zero. They were bending the laws of the universe, doing what was not supposed to be possible. It was the greatest scientific achievement to date. Twisting blue light joined the white noise and pulses of energy. The pressure increased until all the scientists in the room were having trouble remaining conscious. The sheer density of the energy pouring through was simply intense. One by one, they started dropping like flies. Only a handful was strong enough to be able to stay awake, even if they shook in fear. A cold feeling of dread gripped Rika's heart as she sat on standby, knowing that at this rate she would be patching up more than one person. It was the sole reason that she was sitting in a room full of scientists. She was there because they were pulling a living, breathing human being through a transdimensional portal. It was dangerous work. The 12 still conscious revved the machine like an engine, focusing on the central point in the other world. The machine hiccuped, and a blast of energy pushed against them, shattering the glass and sending loose objects flying every which way. It was lucky that no one was hit by stray debris, though it gave her quite a scare. A low droning filled the air, making Rika's ears ache. She had doubts. It seemed as though if the person they pulled through wouldn't kill them, the machine would. It was practically suicide. Just as she was about to voice her uncertainty, the head scientist beat her to it. "We need more." Vegapunk's shout was momentarily louder than the noise. Out of the corner of her eye she saw Toma dive for the panel at the side of the room. He flicked a handful of switches and replaced wires, and the light grew steadily more intense while the rest of the room dimmed. She covered her ears and crouched low next to a desk, trying to shield her eyes. An insane laugh drifted above it all, ringing in her ears and taunting her. One of the scientists had gone mad. The man tried to jump over his desk and towards the light, but was tackled to the ground by 2 others. With those 3 out of the picture, it was down to 9. Rika could only watch in horror as the energy continued to tug at her will, and she forced it away. Vegapunk dived for one of the computers. His fingers flew across the keyboard before red lights flashed across the room. He had hacked the grid, and then, in a moment of brilliance and awe, everything was bleached white in a magnificent display of power and destructive force. It was like a controlled explosion. Rika blacked out for a moment, and when she came to the room was in shambles. Everything was scattered, machines broken, people unconscious, and groans of pain lifting up from the others. As far as she could tell, no one was dead. Just to make sure, she forced herself to get up. She drifted along the wreckage of that of a war zone, and found that thankfully everyone was alive and had all their limbs attached. Vegapunk emerged in the fashion of a jack-in-the-box, bits of drywall stuck in his crazy hair and goggles askew. The man scanned the room with narrow eyes, making Rika uneasy. "What do you think he's looking for?" A voice startled her, and she looked down to see Toma lying on his back a few feet away from her. She helped him out from under the ruined desk, and noted that he wouldn't need first aid, but looked considerably worse for wear. "I don't know," she whispered back, her gaze flicking to the man who was tossing desks aside to check under them, ignoring his unconscious subordinates. Suddenly a barking laugh erupted from his throat, and Vegapunk vaulted over the broken furniture. He came to a stop at the side of the room, where a splash of red disrupted the monochromatic color scheme. It was the back of a shirt and thankfully not blood. The scientist dragged the man out of the wall and shook him into a semi-conscious state. Rika could only see his back and the straw hat on his head from where she was. She wondered if he was all right and needed first aid. "Blah," he groaned groggily, and she could vaguely see him bring his hand up to his face to give his eyes a rub. Rika froze, blood running cold at the voice. She knew that voice, and the look on Toma's face said that he too knew exactly who it was. The strongest man in the world. "Welcome to our world, Monkey D. Luffy." Her initial shock refused to leave, and it clung to her like a cold in winter. As Vegapunk lowered the half-conscious man to the ground and let him take a look around, Rika and Toma shared a significant glance. In that one look they both confirmed that it was indeed Luffy that they pulled through, and not an induced hallucination from the energy through the portal, the same energy that made a man go insane. They could still hear the man's quiet giggling. "Have we messed up, or is this some sort of cosmological prank?" she thought while staring blankly at the violently red shirt Luffy was wearing. It looked oddly fitting on him, though Rika had never seen him wear that color before. In fact, everything he was wearing seemed to perfectly contradict everything he usually wore, even though it looked oddly normal on the thin man. "Rika, get over here and make sure he hasn't broken anything," Vegapunk demanded, shaking her out of her stunned musing. Rika opened her mouth to protest. Before realizing that she was the only conscious person in the room with medical experience, she was the doctor. "All right," she stuttered instead and made her way over to the 2 of them. Her leg was scraped by a rather sharp splinter that used to be a desk leg, but it didn't even register. Her mind was at a loss as to why it was her best friend sitting amongst the debris, staring up at her like she was a stranger. There was also the mind-boggling matter of him being the strongest fucking person in his own world. It was quite the conundrum. Fumbling with her first aid kit, she kneeled down next to him and searched for any cuts or bruises. He was pretty scuffed up, having been thrown through a wall and all, but was otherwise fine. He didn't even flinch when she used the alcohol to wipe clean his cuts. Their Luffy would normally whine and fuss, even if it didn't actually hurt that bad. It was alien and slightly disturbing. The front of his shirt was open, and she could clearly see a massive scar in the shape of an X. Rika tried not to look at the grisly shape, but her eyes were almost drawn to it. It looked like a burn scar, and a pretty nasty one at that. This is so bizarre, she thought, noting the way her stomach was churning. She knew that this wasn't Luffy, but at the same time it was, and they looked so similar. Say, Vegapunk, where exactly am I? Luffy spoke for the first time since the little noise he had given when abruptly woken up. The man was glancing around the room with mild confusion, obviously not recognizing it, though it seemed as though he recognized the eccentric inventor. If he recognized him, then maybe there was some hope. Maybe he really was Luffy after all. For a moment the elderly man frowned before a huge smirk swept across his face. Marineford. If Vegapunk expected a comical outburst from the kid, like Toma and Rika did, then they were all surprised when his fists clenched, looking like he was ready to murder someone. Why? Luffy asked. No, demanded. The tone sent shivers down Rika's spine, and she momentarily paused in her application of first aid to stare at how white his knuckles had become. Vegapunk's smile turned into a grimace. Oh, I guess I haven't explained what's going on yet. Luffy pushed Rika's hand aside from where she had been bandaging a larger cut on his wrist before getting to his feet. She rose too, and Toma came over to stand beside her. He had been previously trying to rouse the others, but people more or less well off than him went to do the job instead. You see, you are now what we call an alternate universe. Events, people, even the world itself could be altered from yours. Another world. He looked shocked. Yes, we can send you back soon, so there isn't a need to panic, Vegapunk said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. The man continued to frown. What about my Nakama? They'll be worried if I disappear. I honestly didn't think about that. Rika and Toma both slapped their palms to their faces, sighing in dual exasperation. The man was a genius beyond his time, but sometimes he overlooked tiny details that had to do with the response and not the actual invention. Luffy opened his mouth, ready to let loose his anger at the scientist, but thankfully Rika had seen it coming and put her hand on his shoulder. The lab is destroyed, so we can't do much about it right now, but he'll come up with something. She sent Vegapunk a glare, indicating that he was to leave. He took the hint, sliding away to his computer, which had recorded all the data from the portal. Rika and Toma stared at Luffy as he continued to examine the destroyed room. She was about to say something, but was interrupted. So, Luffy, are you really the strongest person in your world? Toma asked, grinning widely in excitement. He was obviously very impressed with the supposed title. Luffy's mood changed instantaneously, going from frustration to pride in a matter of moments. Yeah, he declared, giving a shishishi of happiness, hands on his hips and smile nearly blinding. Even stronger than Whitebeard. Of course, I doubt that he'd be happy that you stole his title, Rika murmured nervously. He's dead, so he can't get upset anyway. Dead? Both Toma and Rika exclaimed in astonishment. Who killed him? Toma asked, starting to shake. It was one thing to become the strongest man, but the other one had died first. What the bloody hell had happened in that world? Luffy spat the name out in disgust. Blackbeard? Does Blackbeard cause you a lot of trouble? Rika asked. In their world, Teach was one of the 4 Yonkou and the one who pretty much started the war. They had their hands full with him, so he must be a pain for the people in this other Luffy's world too. Not anymore. What do you mean, not anymore? I beat the crap out of him. It was really hard to do though, because he stole Whitebeard's devil fruit. They shivered, even as the red-wearing Luffy laughed at some memory. Toma grabbed Rika and scooted away from him. Luffy just tilted his head to the side in confusion. Damn it, I'd never really considered the possibility, Toma swore under his breath. Rika, we have to be careful around him. This isn't the Luffy that we know. He's someone else, understand? She nodded, already having come to that conclusion. It was just disconcerting when he had the face of her best friend. Rumble, hey, you two, can I get some food? Although, they are going to be similar. Seeing Luffy eat was always fascinating. The way that he would impulsively stuff his face like a starving wild animal, or that whenever his grandfather was around he would eat extra fast and choke half the time, was a sight to behold. It was like he inhaled it, simply foregoing chewing and swallowing. During Luffy's mealtimes, everyone would move to other tables so that they wouldn't have their food stolen by wandering fingers. The kid was flexible and had a long reach. To other people, it was disgusting and resulted in a lack of appetite, so they gladly handed their food to him. This just filled more of his bottomless pit of his stomach. However, there was always a line to be drawn. This was just ridiculous. The amount of food he was shoveling down his gullet easily exceeded his normal appetite. Spectators had given up on the idea of eating to simply watch in awe as he finished plate after plate without showing any sort of sign of slowing down. Bottomless pit indeed. Rika grimaced and pitted his nakama for the food bills they must have if this was normal. He was different, so different and yet at the same time exactly the same. He was still childish, laughing at the silliest things and acting so carefree. The laugh was the same too, but there was a certain edge in his eyes that made her feel like she was dealing with a wild animal. Certainly a very affectionate wild animal. Rub his belly and feed him and he was content, but he had claws and fangs that could tear through them without any effort. Physically, there were some obvious differences. This Luffy seemed more flexible and lithe, but definitely more muscle. He also didn't carry any weapons. And when Toma asked him what he fought with, he replied, "My fists. Freestyle fighting." So that was rather strange. Another thing that she noticed is that when Vegapunk had mentioned something that he didn't really like hearing, he had gotten downright scary. She wouldn't have believed it otherwise, but he could and would get mean if he needed to. Their Luffy could be stern when pressed, but it felt more like an adult catching a child with his hand in the cookie jar, not a demon just waiting for the chance to attack. So similar, but so very different. Word was slowly spreading through headquarters of the mysterious project that the science division had been working on. People were starting to flood the room, packed into the edges like sardines to catch a glimpse at the strongest man in the world. They were just as shocked as Rika and Toma were when they found it was Luffy. She saw the doubtful glances and shaking heads. They couldn't believe it. However, they hadn't seen his scary side yet. It was all the proof she needed. Toma raised an eyebrow at her from across the table that the three of them were currently seated at. The two of them were sitting a few feet away from Luffy, trying to stay out of the splash zone. He noticed her glowering at the rather large crowd. "You okay?" he asked, ducking his head as a bone of some animal flew over his head. She nodded but said nothing in reply. "Hey, you, is there any more?" She was startled and looked to the side to see Luffy's abnormally large eyes staring right at her without blinking. She suppressed the urge to shudder and answered his question. "Why, yeah," she stuttered and motioned towards the window into the kitchen. After about 30 seconds, yet more food was wheeled out so that the man could continue gorging. She cursed herself. Normally she wasn't this skittish. Another thing that bothered her was that this Luffy had absolutely no idea who they were. He didn't recognize Toma or Rika, his two best friends. It made her sad that he was so much stronger in his world but hadn't needed the two of them. Well, he did say that he had nakama, just not them. Frowning and looking back towards Toma, she noticed a burly man stalk towards their table. He had separated from the ring of bystanders around the room and was steadily advancing without resistance. "Is there something you need?" she drawled when he approached. Suddenly, she recognized the man. It was Garth, someone that their Luffy bunked with. He hated weakness and sometimes picked on Luffy just to get a rise out of the normally cheerful kid. It was also pretty obvious that he wasn't exactly the smartest of men, and a stereotypical muscle head. Luffy beat the crap out of him every once in a while, but Garth was as stubborn as a bull. He smirked. "No, I just wanted to talk to my friend here." It was obvious that the only reason Garth was here was because he'd heard the outrageous rumors and wanted to disprove them. He expected this Luffy was weaker because he wasn't wearing the Marine's uniform, which was absolute bullshit. If this Luffy was the strongest man, then she somewhat expected him to get angry or try and backtalk Garth. But Luffy ignored him. It wasn't the kind of "if I don't pay attention to him he'll leave me alone" sort of ignoring. It was that he genuinely either didn't care or didn't notice. He continued to stuff his face, not paying any attention to the now irritated Garth. "Boy, I'm talking to you." Garth got absolutely nothing out of the red-shirted man. Toma and Rika shared a confused glance. It was simply baffling. Garth was just as confused and stood there with his mouth half open and eyebrows upturned. When he didn't gather the reaction that he wanted, slammed his fists down on the table and shouted at the much smaller man. Again, there was no reaction, just face stuffing. By this time, the entire room was focused on the little scene in the center of the room. They had also realized that this wouldn't have been their Luffy's reaction, and was eager to see what this newcomer would do. Garth had enough of being in the background, and did the most natural thing. He grabbed the piece of food that was currently in Luffy's hands and tossed it over his shoulder. "Yeah, that got the guy's attention all right. Bastard, I was gonna eat that," Luffy growled, glaring at the man. Garth took this as an act of weakness and laughed, throwing his head back. Now that he had the strongest man's undivided attention, he was reveling in the chance to try and drive him into the ground. Sorry, I just needed to talk to you, and since you were so distracted, I needed to grab your focus. Luffy frowned in return. Then what do you want? Garth was taken aback and needed a moment to organize his thoughts. Well, I don't know what you're trying to pull, but if you think we're going to believe this bullshit, then you're going to be in a world of hurt. He smiled in mockery and confidence, believing that he had done a good job at being intimidating. Behind him, some people looked uncertain, while some rolled their eyes or outright glared at the people from the science division. Rika could practically see what Toma was thinking at that moment. The crowd was displeased and refused to believe the possibility that maybe this was a different, stronger Luffy from another world and not their Luffy, who would have punched Garth in the face already. She watched as Luffy lowered his chin, but not in a submissive gesture. The way that his hat shadowed his eyes so one was out of view caused the air around them to grow thicker. The menacing aura combined with the intimidating appearance of the shadowed eyes made Rika's gut clench in fear and her breath catch in her throat. You want to fight? He asked in a lower, deadly calm voice. Garth, poor, ignorant Garth, pressed on. He laughed right in Luffy's face. You mean with you? That would be a waste of my time. Instead of getting angry, like they expected once again, Luffy shrugged and continued eating. Garth's attempts at goading him on failed completely. Enraged, Garth threw his fist at the other's face, intending to knock at least a few teeth out. And then, something miraculous happened, stunning everyone in the room into a vegetative state. Like he knew exactly where it was going to hit, and without pausing in his eating, Luffy grabbed Garth's fist with one hand, effectively and completely stopping it. Garth growled and tried to release his hand, but the grip was like iron. With an effortless flick of his wrist, Luffy sent Garth flying over his shoulder and into the other wall. The crowd parted like the Red Sea, staring with jaws on the floor at the Garth-sized hole in the wall. The unconscious man was embedded deeply in the brick. In that moment they knew, without a doubt, that his man was not to be messed with. He wasn't their Luffy. He was the strongest man in the world. Footsteps echoed through the eerily silent room. The doors were flung open and the silhouette of Sengoku himself filled the doorway. He took one glance at the hole in the wall and still eating Luffy, and effectively summed up the situation in his head. Monkey D. Luffy, he called. The man called paused to look up at Sengoku. Whether it was in fear or respect, Rika couldn't tell, but after that display of raw power she assumed it was the latter. I need to speak to you. The vice admirals were whispering among themselves. In the war room they sat with tense shoulders and spoke in hushed voices. Doubts and theories flitted around the room, filling it with a dull droning only this sort of activity could create. The strongest man in the world was at headquarters, and rumored to be stronger than Whitebeard himself. Immediately after the explosion that occurred in the science lab, panic and discord had rippled through headquarters. All of the admirals and vice admirals had been assembled for an emergency meeting, and shortly after Vegapunk had entered to explain the situation. Monkey D. Luffy was the name of the strongest man. It left them all speechless. They had no idea what to make of it. Kizaru and Aokiji waited patiently for Sengoku and Luffy to arrive. They sat on either side of the fleet admiral's chair, watching the door like birds of prey. They arrived without a special entrance and with a lack of gusto. The vice admirals didn't even realize that Sengoku had arrived until the man cleared his throat rather loudly. They immediately quieted down and watched as he proceeded to his own seat across the room. In the doorway, looking just as boyish as they expected, was Monkey D. Luffy. Get out of the way, kid. A gruff voice rumbled, and the person belonging to the voice shoved Luffy aside to enter the room. It was Admiral Akainu, who hadn't gotten the memo and did not know that he pushed aside the reason the meeting had been called. They all watched in mild horror as Luffy's fists clenched and he gritted his teeth in half-suppressed rage. For what reason, they couldn't fathom. Pure hatred rolled off of him in waves. Only when Akainu had taken his seat that Luffy looked right at Sengoku. Make him leave, he snarled, motioning towards a somewhat confused Akainu. The man didn't understand why the kid was calling the shots. I'm afraid I can't do that. Admiral Akainu is a key part of our military and has just as much right to be here as anyone else. Sengoku tried to reason with the kid, but it didn't seem to be working. Though his voice was patient, it was also very strained and tired. I don't care. Get rid of him or I will. The threat was left hanging in the air. Ha ha ha. Is this kid for real? Who the hell is he? Akainu's barking laugh filled the room, accompanied by the sound of him slapping his knee. He's the reason we're here. This is the person Vegapunk got, Sengoku stated as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. That effectively shut Akainu up, and the older man eyed Luffy with some distrust. He didn't laugh again. Luffy, I don't know what you have against him, and I don't really care. If he stays quiet, will you let him stay? Sengoku was being rather lenient. Everyone thought. He obviously trusted Vegapunk, despite the pain that the scientist sometimes was. Luffy looked like he was going to throw something, but instead frowned and nodded once. Take a seat then. Cautiously, and shooting Akainu a distrusting glare, he sat down at the empty chair closest to the door. Everyone's eyes were focused solely upon him, but he did not fidget under their gaze. After a moment of tense silence, Luffy's impatience got the better of him. "So, what did you want then?" Sengoku paused for dramatic effect, before sighing, "I hate to admit it, but we need help. I don't know if Vegapunk told you yet, but we brought you into this world to ask for your assistance." Luffy blinked owlishly at them for a few moments. They could practically see the gears turning in his head as he processed what they were asking. "My help." He said it to himself more than anything, just to confirm that they were serious. Sengoku nodded in response to the rhetorical question. Luffy then laughed. Not a chuckle or his trademark shishishi, but a full-blown howl of laughter. They were quite taken aback. There they were, having poured in countless bellies into the project, hours upon hours of labor, taken the time to send Garp on a faux mission, and had stooped so low as to ask for a single person's help, and he laughed at them. It was pretty insulting. Akainu and a few of the vice admirals looked ready to object, a few rising to their feet in rage. Sengoku put up his hand as a call for order, and as the laughter died down they reluctantly took their seats. Luffy then looked straight at Sengoku, a mischievous grin on his face. "What's in it for me?" he asked. They were all confused, but thankfully Sengoku took it all in great stride. Vegapunk himself had said that there was a chance that he wouldn't help them. He was prepared for this. "What would you want in payment?" "Meat," he declared immediately, causing a bead of sweat to form on everyone's temple. Luffy then paused to actually consider the proposition, "and lots of money. Nami'll kill me if I don't bring at least that much back." Sengoku was unsure how much lots entailed, but pushed it to the back of his mind. "Very well. What? You can't actually be serious," Akainu objected, breaking his implied order to remain silent. He slammed his fist against the table and glared at his superior. "Hold on a minute, why don't we give the kid a chance first?" Vegapunk assured us that he was the real deal, after all. Surprisingly, it was Kizaru who had spoken, getting to the point before Sengoku. The fleet admiral nodded his head and looked over at Aokiji. Aokiji always had great ideas, so it was no surprise to him when they all fixated on him, searching for the logical answer to their problem. Even Akainu had halted in his protest to listen to him. "How about we have him take care of one of the former Shichibukai?" The Shichibukai were widely known as one of the three great powers on the Grand Line, a sort of in-between. Not really on the Marines' side, but not really pirates. However, when the war started, the Marines had demanded that they chose a side and go with it. Unfortunately, most of them had chosen piracy. Some claimed to be simply watching the war unfold, but the Marines, being suspicious of all pirates, never really believed them. If Luffy indeed was the strongest man, then defeating one of the Shichibukai wouldn't be a problem. If he was a fake, he would be pulverized. The tension started to dissipate, and everyone calmed down. "How about we have him take care of that traitor Jinbei?" someone suggested. There were nods of heads, and they looked towards the boy for his answer. He was frowning. "I won't fight Jinbei for you." "Why not?" "I won't fight Jinbei." "How about Crocodile?" "He's been a real pain in our ass since that whole Alabasta fiasco," another vice admiral suggested. Like the first time, they looked for Luffy's answer. "Alabasta?" he asked instead. "Did something happen there?" In the middle of their civil war, Crocodile caused a massive explosion in the capital city. Among the dead were the royal family and the pirate Nico Robin, but most of the deceased were innocent citizens. Luffy's eyes took on a murderous glint, and a shiver of apprehension and an instinctual fear for one's life passed through all people in the room. Even the admirals and fleet admiral found themselves wishing that they wouldn't have to fight the small man. "I'll take care of Crocodile." Sengoku was startled. Strange thoughts swirled in his mind and threatened to overwhelm him. Who was this man, who had just made every vice admiral in the room wet themselves out of fear? The boy was hardly an adult, smaller than most people in the room, and half the time he just grinned stupidly. Sengoku frowned. How perplexing. A fitting word indeed, as he felt a shudder pass down his own spine. The child wasn't even emitting haki, and he could still feel the strength of his will from across the room. He hadn't felt such a thing since the time Roger ran rampant across the world. Perhaps Monkey D. Luffy, the child that he often found hiding under his desk with stolen food or hiding from his grandfather, was capable of things they wouldn't even be able to comprehend. Maybe, just maybe, he was the strongest man in the world. He was intrigued. "I'll take care of Crocodile." 5 words, and everyone could feel the approaching doom. Emotions and half-forgotten sensations from nightmares when they were children resurfaced. And while they were strong enough to not cry out for their mothers, they were left wishing for the same comfort. Sengoku watched as a few of his men gripped the edge of the table or their knees until their knuckles turned white. A few broke out into a cold sweat. There was a satisfied, cold glint in the man's black eyes before he smirked. Some were able to breathe once more, and Sengoku could feel his legs again. All gazes were fixed firmly on the kid sitting in a deceptively innocent manner in the chair closest to the door, straight across from Sengoku. He had his arms crossed over his chest, partially hiding his large scar from view. His shoulders were slumped and relaxed. His back leaned against the chair. Luffy and Sengoku didn't break eye contact through the entire event. And when the boy broke out into a mocking, self-satisfied, cat-like grin, the Fleet Admiral narrowed his eyes. It was as if he knew something Sengoku didn't, and liked to keep that something tickling the edges of his senses, driving him mad with curiosity. He gave one curt nod, signaling that he was fine with the arrangement. If Luffy wanted to fight Crocodile, then he was welcome too. The former Shichibukai, as one of his vice admirals had said, had been a rather large problem for them recently. He had defected, caused the deaths of nearly an entire country, wiped out a royal family, and murdered a woman they'd been after since her debut at the burning of Ohara. It was embarrassing. Crocodile wasn't one to be messed with. He had a painfully useful Loja-type devil fruit, was incredibly cunning and absolutely ruthless, a bad combination. However, after that display of power, Sengoku had little doubt that the scruffy young man sitting across from him could handle the sand croc without breathing heavily. It was getting over that fact that would take some time and getting used to. Luffy rose to his feet. "Find me when you're ready to take me to him," he simply stated while adjusting the straw hat on his head. The boy then turned to leave, walking right out of the war room like it was the most natural thing to do, like there weren't the Marine's top officials watching his every move. His arrogance was another thing that needed to be minded. The door clicked back into place, and the room felt marginally warmer. The strung-up Marines collapsed in their seats, one or two fighting back tears. Sengoku's frown grew deeper as he exchanged glances with his admirals. A stray thought caught his attention. When Luffy heard of Alabasta's fate, he was wearing the same expression he wore when facing down Admiral Akainu. They found him wandering the halls like a lost puppy. Toma was the first to spot him. Luffy strolled down the hallway, glancing over his shoulder every so often and arms comfortably placed behind his head. He looked both relaxed and nervous. He refused to look out the windows, which Rika thought odd because the view was fantastic. "Boy, Luffy," Toma called, causing the one addressed to pause in his wandering. He looked over at the two of them, and a smile broke out across his unusually somber face. She and Toma trotted up to him. "What did Fleet Admiral Sengoku want with you?" Rika blurted out. It had been nagging her since the man had barged in earlier in the day. They hardly ever saw him even close to the mess hall, so it was surprising in the act itself, never mind the reason for the visit. Luffy chuckled, eyes twinkling with amusement. "He wants my help, but first wants proof that I'm strong." "Proof?" Toma asked. "I'm going to go beat the crap out of Crocodile for them." Rika felt her stomach drop. Sure, this Luffy was scary and could easily toss a 200-pound man over his shoulder, but Crocodile was a former Shichibukai. He's the strongest man in the world, she reminded herself. On another note, Luffy not only looked at ease with the decision, but as though he was looking forward to it. "He's got a pretty nasty ability, so be careful at least," Toma said in warning. "I know. I've fought him before." "You have?" Rika asked. Luffy nodded, but he frowned sullenly, as though it brought heavy memories. "You can feel it, can't you?" Vice Admiral Stainless murmured, sipping at an alcoholic drink only serving to calm his frayed nerves. They were all a little uneasy as of late. His fellow in arms said nothing in reply, eyes trained on the people running about below. His usually dopey eyes were sharp and attentive. The two of them watched in silence as they watched their subordinates. The Luffy kid had arranged a sort of impromptu soccer game on the main deck to pass the time. Many of the lower-ranking officers and a few of the older ones had joined in until both teams had a decent amount of players. Luffy was dominating the field, using his now apparent speed to easily dart between people. The vice admirals on the deck above could tell that he was going easy on the other players and had little doubt that he could move much faster. "There's something I don't like about that kid," Yamakaji said. "It's like..." "I know." They had no need to explain. The cold feeling settled in their guts. The nervousness they both felt since the boy had walked into their meeting that day a week prior. An instinctual wariness towards the monster currently laughing his head off as he passed the ball to someone else. Currently they were on a warship wading through the Grand Line towards Alabasta. Crocodile had a thing for sand and fought the best on his home turf, so the ex-Shichibukai was reluctant to leave the ruined country. The last inhabitants of the island remained, crushed, defeated, but still loyal to the late sovereigns. The Marines hadn't been prepared to move in, having to deal with a large-scale war blossoming on the horizon, so they let Croc have the desolate country. "Do you think he has ties with their royal family?" "Probably, considering his reaction to the news of their deaths," Stainless concluded. Luffy's reaction had been a little strange, but they only noticed in hindsight. At the time they had been too afraid to think clearly. But he also looked pretty angry at Admiral Akainu. "For a moment I thought he was going to attack him," Yamakaji admitted, a shiver traveling up and down his spine. He took a cigar out of his pocket and lit it. "There's obviously bad blood between them." The stones were already worn down by sand, the blurred letters hardly legible in the setting sun. The sand was stained orange in the dying light. Monkey D. Luffy sat down before the stones, his head bowed and mouth silent. The boy had taken his hat off as a sign of respect. The crew that had traveled with him to Alabasta's capital watched on as the boy mourned the royal family of their world. Tears swam on the edges of some of their eyes as they took in the sad sight before them. 2 gravestones were erected in front of the crater that used to be a Lubarna, each representing the 2 members of the royal family, Nefertari Cobra and Nefertari Vivi. To their backs was a field of wooden memorials to honor the rest of the dead. There were no remains, only empty graves. The explosion had erased everything. After many minutes of solemn silence, Luffy slowly rose to his feet and replaced the hat onto the crown of his head. When he turned around, his face was like stone. The man simply stalked past the rest of them, shoving people aside when needed. They watched, speechless, as Luffy steadily made his way towards the 2 vice admirals at the back of the crowd. He stopped in front of them to make his demands. "We're going to rainbase." "Rainbase," Stainless said with a frown. That's where Crocodile will be," Luffy said with certainty. Their arrival at rainbase was a quiet one, but not unnoticed. There were people there, scraggly, skinny, and sick-looking people whose eyes showed their lack of hope, and the way they waked seemed like to shuffle to the execution stand. Soon enough they recognized the group as the Marines. Light flashed in dull eyes, and they instinctively flocked to the promise of safety. A crowd of followers accumulated behind them as they trekked through the city towards its heart. Stainless and Yamakaji exchanged glances, but wordlessly followed their self-declared leader. Luffy strode through the city as though he knew his way around. His face was shadowed by his hat, but the unfortunate Marines didn't need to look at his face to read his mood. He was radiating the intent to kill. When they arrived at the casino in the middle of the city, Crocodile was waiting for them. His own little personal army consisted of at least 10 Bananawanis, the Baroque Works agents, and many, many footmen. The small group of Marines were instantly surrounded. The vice admirals let their hands rest on the hilt of their swords or guns, eyes darting back and forth at the crowd. People were about to get hurt. The agents and their partners watched the group of Marines with hungry, blood-lusted eyes. They stretched muscles, cracked knuckles, or readied weapons. The Bananawanis licked their lips and eyed the tiny men, anticipating their next meals. And then there stood Crocodile on top of the bridge, crossing his personal lake in all his slicked back hair, face scar, cigar smoking, huge coat glory, grinning down at them smugly. "Boy, mustache Asen." Luffy spoke for the first time since they left Ulubarna. Stainless, who had given up trying to correct the boy on the use of the annoying nickname, turned his head to stare at the boy's back. "You wanted him alive, right?" "Yes," Stainless said, eyebrows drawing together. "Why would he?" A burst of incredibly intense haki erupted from the small man's body, and their eyes immediately rolled back into their heads as each and every one of them fainted. "What's wrong with not wanting anyone to die?" "People die." He received a stinging slap. Luffy walked forward towards the dumbfounded Crocodile. He could tell that the former Shichibukai had wanted to unleash his self-centered egotistical speech about how there was no chance in hell that they would survive and that it was a waste of time to come all the way out there. The Pirate King had already heard that drivel and wasn't inclined to listen to it again. "Stop talking like that. I'm not going to let you say that again. That's exactly what we're trying to prevent. Not the rebel army, not the royal army. No one in this country is at fault. So why does anyone have to die? It's all Crocodile's fault." He punched her in the face. "Then why are you risking your life? In this world, he wasn't there for her. She probably did all she could to stop the rebellion. And because she had no one to rely on, she died." Luffy cracked his knuckles as he ascended the stairs to the bridge across the moat, heading right for Crocodile. He had purposely left Crocodile conscious so that he would be awake when Luffy beat the shit out of him. In his own world, Crocodile was no longer a threat. He stayed out of the king's way and avoided Alabasta like the plague. He knew that if he went anywhere near Vivi or her country, Luffy would kill him. From looking at this country, what needs to be done most? She started to punch and slap him, taking out her frustration on the boy she was sitting on. "What of it is even clear to me. You think risking your one life will be enough? Then what am I supposed to risk? What am I?" He grabbed her arms to stop her abuse of him. "I have nothing else left to risk." "Nothing." It enraged him. He threw her off. "Try risking our lives along with yours. We're your nakama," she cried. Not here. She had no nakama to rely on here. She was dead. Robin too. The Luffy in this world wasn't a pirate, so he hadn't gotten involved with Alabasta's civil war. Vivi died, and he hadn't met Robin either. It made him sick to think that his archaeologist would have been snuffed out like a candle, no one caring about her death and simply fading from the world as though she was worth nothing. Luffy would be sure to hug her when he got back, and then go visit Vivi and hug her too. "I want to live." Words and memories crowded his mind as he rushed forward and punched Crocodile in the gut before the slimy man could even process what was going on. Luffy hadn't even needed to use Basashoku Haki to send him flying into his casino. Luffy launched himself in after his prey. Crocodile was still on the floor as he swooped in to deliver a rather nasty blow to the jaw. As he expected, Crocodile had recovered a little and managed to activate his devil fruit powers. His head disintegrated, shortly followed by the rest of his body. "Where did you come from?" Crocodile growled in an echoic voice. He did not materialize, clearly betraying his fear. Another world, Luffy hissed before jumping into the air and striking with a haki-imbued fist. That section of Crocodile's body and his head solidified as the man coughed up blood. Luffy sent the wretch to the floor, where he stared as Luffy landed in front of him. The whole room shook as a shockwave passed, though. Crocodile knew in that moment that he was a dead man. This small person was only toying with him, drawing out the battle only to satisfy the urge to destroy. Luffy pulled back his arm before throwing his upper half forward. The fist collided painfully with his chest, and he felt a handful of ribs crumble. A foot came as a follow-up and kicked him to the side into another wall. The pirate ran forward and swung a right hook into Crocodile's jaw. He heard a snap, and blood sprayed against the wall where the Croc's face collided with it. Luffy wasn't hitting as hard as he knew he could. He wanted him to stay conscious. Livid eyes offset the stony expression that the boy wore. Obviously, Crocodile had done something to piss him off. The former Shichibukai contemplated this as he was sent tumbling across the floor, leaving a bloody trail in his wake. Footsteps accompanied Crocodile's labored breathing. The nearly dead man looked up to see the man looming over him, preparing for another blow. With much effort and a little bit of blood, he managed to cough. "What have I done to you?" Luffy's eyes widened and then narrowed. "You killed Vivi, her family, her people, and Robin. I'll never forgive you. You said you're from another world. The other me wasn't here for them. So instead I'll give the Robin and Vivi of this world the revenge they deserve." "Why are you fighting for them? In this world, though. Because, even if it's another world, they're still my nakama," Luffy roared and let the punch fly. A crater opened up around them. Before Crocodile lost consciousness, he managed to spit out, "Who the hell do you think you are?" Luffy brought both of his hands together right above Crocodile's head. His eyes were icy cold now. "I am," he began before snarling at his victim, the Pirate King. The boy stopped just short of shattering Crocodile's skull, and the ex-Shichibukai knew no more. Stainless felt chills consume his body periodically. His eyes flickered open before he tried to sit up. Groans drifted up from his party as the others began to wake. The first thing he noticed was that he was surrounded by people who were either out like a light or barely lucid. Yamakaji seemed to be in a similar state as him. As vice admirals, stronger than the average Samaritan, they were among the first to awake. None of the Baroque Works agents or backup was conscious, having felt the brunt of the impact. All were sprawled out in front of rain dinners, some foaming at the mouth. The wave of haki had knocked all of them out in less than a second. Just how powerful is he? He thought in dismay. That's when he looked over at the casino to see it in absolute ruins. He gaped at the figure standing on top of the pile. Luffy jumped down from his work, dragging a bloody pulp of a human being and looking like he hadn't even broken a sweat from his destructive activities. Luffy dropped the hardly alive ex-Shichibukai at Stainless' feet. The boy crossed his arms over his chest and practically dared the Vice Admiral to object to what he had done. Stainless swallowed thickly and wisely said nothing. Stainless gave a low groan, wiping the sweat off his brow. His sleeves were rolled up his arms and his honorary coat stored within his luggage. The hot sun was beating down on them without mercy. Mother Nature was not feeling kind. They were on their way to Urumalu to meet up with the ship that was to take them back to Marineford. The locals of Rainbase had offered to take them all back via sand ship, which the Marines happily agreed to. None of them were very keen on traveling camelback. After freeing the oppressed people, they were honored as heroes. They were all still trying to rouse themselves from Luffy's haki, but were otherwise just peaky. The Marines quickly rounded up the remnants of Baroque Works. Everyone marveled over the mass destruction Luffy caused, and they were forced to call a doctor so that Crocodile didn't die before he reached Impel Down. Speaking of Luffy, the young man was currently seated on one of the other sand ships, sleeping. Stainless was rather perturbed by the recent turn of events. All the fears he'd been subconsciously feeling were now brought to the surface. They had been proved. This man was dangerous, and he was infinitely glad that he was on their side. Although, having said that, Stainless was beginning to doubt that. The boy only seemed to be going with the flow, humoring them while they worked on a way to get him home. He even wanted something in return for helping them. Stainless was beginning to wonder if Luffy was actually a Marine. A gust of wind carrying sand took his mind off more morbid thoughts, and he turned his attention to shielding his face. Yamakachi and Stainless swallowed in unison. Both were nervously watching the innocent mollusk stationed on the desk. Its eyes were still closed in sleep, but they knew it wouldn't be for long. They were expecting a call. Baloo baloo baloo, baloo baloo baloo, baloo baloo baloo. The snail suddenly animated, opening its beady eyes to stare up at the two vice admirals as though to say, "Pick up already." Muttering something incomprehensible, Stainless reached over and picked up the microphone attachment. "Kancha, Vice Admiral, please deliver your report," the snail said in Admiral Akainu's voice, and both of them began to sweat profusely. "Why yes, sir, we're leaving the country now, sir. Crocodile is in custody. So Monkey D. Luffy actually succeeded in defeating him." "Yes, sir. Tell me exactly what happened, in as much detail as you can." Stainless winced before beginning to speak. I'm sorry, sir, but there isn't much I can tell. We arrived at Crocodile's hideout, and just before we began to fight with Baroque Works, he asked for clarification on whether or not we wanted Crocodile alive. After I gave him an answer, he knocked all of us unconscious. How? He used Heishoku Haki, sir. We didn't even stand a chance, he admitted. There hadn't even been any resistance in him against that raw power and dominance. It was nothing like he'd experienced before. I see. Continue. When we awoke, Crocodile's base was rubble and Crocodile himself wasn't in much better condition. What about the boy? He wasn't even tired, sir. There was a moment of silence, which Stainless assumed was a thoughtful reflection on the new information. Thank you for the report. You may return to your duties. The reply was short and formal. The snail fell asleep once more. Luffy was forced into the meeting, which was, ironically enough, about him again. This time it was only he, Sengoku, and his 3 admirals. He allowed himself to be brought into the war room by the back of his shirt like some sort of dog, pouting the entire while and dragging his feet when he could. He was surprisingly light for being so strong, so Aokiji had no problems whatsoever carrying him all the way through headquarters from his sort of party. They just broke out the sake too. The Pirate King was deposited just inside the door, and he decided that a place on top of the table would be a nice spot for his snack. The other 2 admirals watched with one eye open as he sat Indian style on top of their nice clean conference table and began gobbling up hunks of greasy meat, which he'd brought with him. Luffy watched them in return. He closely monitored all 3 admirals and their body language. He didn't trust them, and that bastard Akainu made his hackles rise. He was trying to remain calm, but the mere mention of his name made his vision go red. That motherfucker was one of the very few people he would never forgive. But this was one of those few occasions that patience and manners were necessary. He was relying on the Marines to get him home, which annoyed him, but he had no control over. Surely if he presented himself as their enemy, they would throw their lives at keeping him down. And the longer he was here, the longer he was away from his nakama. God knew how much he missed them. Luffy was aware of Sengoku's presence long before he arrived. The fleet admiral entered the room with a scowl on his face. He swept past them and assumed his seat, reclining with a sigh and pinching the bridge of his nose. Monkey D. Luffy, I have to thank you for cleaning up that mess in Alabasta for us. Luffy grimaced. It wasn't the first time that he'd cleaned up their mess, so I have no problem formally asking you for assistance. Luffy continued to eat, but slower this time. He kept eye contact with Sengoku. The fleet admiral began to explain their predicament. We are currently in the midst of a war between 4 factions, the Marines, Blackbeard and Big Mom, the Revolutionary Army, and an alliance between Whitebeard and Redhair. Blackbeard? He's currently our main priority. After he took down one of the supernovas and betrayed us, we've been looking for a way to stop him. However, all our attempts have failed. The Pirate King snorted. You can't fight him the normal way. His devil fruit powers neutralize other devil fruit powers on top of having his own. All 4 Marines looked quite taken aback. He watched them out of the corner of his eye as he shoved several pounds of spare meat down his throat. Kizaru gave a short laugh. Well, that explains why even one of us had trouble with him. Aokiji nodded in agreement. Luffy didn't mind Aokiji as much as the others. The Iceman had even lent him a hand in certain situations. He also saved Robin as a child and let them escape on several occasions. Right now Luffy could tell that the Admiral was trying to read him, trying to find some sort of sign that the rubber man would betray them. Well, Luffy wasn't exactly the betraying type. He was very straightforward. If the Marines held up their end of the deal, he had no problem helping them out, as long as they didn't ask him to fight people who he liked in his own world. But there was also another thing bothering him. That blonde girl, Rice, or something like that, and her friend that looked like a mouse often talked about the other him, who was a Marine. They obviously knew him. What bothered him was that he hadn't encountered his other self at all yet. What I want to know is what exactly you did to that Shichibukai. You hid that battle. Akainu's dog-like growl shook Luffy out of his inner musings. The Pirate King looked over at the Admiral, trying not to spit fire and attack him. No one else spoke while Luffy and Akainu had their own little stare down. If anyone else had been awake, they would have fought each other, Luffy said, giving one of the reasons he'd knocked everyone out at rainbase. Listen, you stupid brat. I don't care who the hell you are, but I don't like your attitude. Akainu had unwittingly crossed a line drawn in Luffy's mind. Any sign of aggression would be punished accordingly. The way the Admiral spoke began to make the pirate feel sick. He even stopped eating, but even the red-hot glare he sent wouldn't shut the man up. Luffy hopped off the table and sent a fist straight into the man's incessant gob. He made sure not to hit hard enough to knock him unconscious, as that would be bad. Luffy stalked over to the lava man, who was trying to sit up with his back to the wall. 3 pairs of eyes drilled into his back. He grabbed Akainu by the throat, squeezing his windpipe with a little more force than necessary. The man would definitely have bruising later. Listen, I'll only say it once, Luffy rumbled in a threateningly low voice. I am so close to ripping your guts out and feeding them to you. One wrong move and I'll take pleasure in killing you slowly and painfully. Understand? Akainu, despite not knowing how he got in Luffy's bad graces, nodded, grabbing at the hand closed around his neck. Absolutely disgusted by the wretch, Luffy threw Akainu to the side. The heavy body of the admiral crashed through the wall. He made his way to the door, grabbing his hat and securing it back on his head. I'll help you, but keep that bitch away from me, or I will go through with my threat, he said to Sengoku. The tone of his voice left no room for arguments. Garp scowled over a new edition of the newspaper. ALABASTA restored. X Shichibukai sent to Impel down. When the hell did this happen? By the date printed on it. This was a fairly recent event. The inside story was mostly based on rumors and speculation, but the key point was that the Marines were responsible for the shift in power. He scowled. Such a plan would never be hidden from him unless there was something else behind it, something that he would have protested against. A cold feeling filled his gut. This wasn't going to end well. Jai-chan, what you're reading? Luffy's obnoxious voice floated by his ear, and the Vice Admiral flinched. The boy had somehow climbed onto his chair and was now dangling over the back of it, trying to read over his grandfather's shoulder. Garp sighed and massaged one of his temples. The newspaper, the easiest way to satiate the boy down was to give quick, simple answers to his quick, simple question. Anything interesting going on? Garp decided that his grandson didn't need to know about the crocodile incident and turned to another, more mundane everyday business page. No, go bother someone else. But they all kicked me out. The boy whined in a high-pitched voice that only seemed to serve the purpose of grating on his nerves. Get out, he yelled before grabbing Luffy by the shirt collar and throwing him towards the door. What are you doing all the way out here? Rika queried with a quiet voice. The young man looked over his shoulder, smiling softly at her. She climbed out onto the roof with him, careful not to slip and fall off the building. The water of the bay sparkled orange and yellow in the sunrise. People were just beginning to rise, so smoke spiraled up from several houses in the city below. Ships were beginning to move, the harbor bells ringing in the morning air. You didn't stay here the entire night, did you? Luffy shook his head no. Rika frowned again. His eyes were distant. Instead of looking at ease when he gazed at the peaceful setting, he seemed more conflicted. She didn't like that. What are you thinking about? My brother, he replied simply. I didn't know you had a brother, she blinked in surprise. We're not brothers by blood, but he's my brother all the same. That made far more sense. Where did you grow up? She asked, settling down next to him on the tiles. East Blue. They returned to silence. Rika let out a sigh as the wind ruffled their hair, her hands clasped in her lap. There was something that had been bothering her lately, something she needed to ask him, but her tongue felt heavy. He turned his face towards her, as though he sensed her inner struggle, and she couldn't refuse that face. Are you a Marine? She whispered hesitantly. He was quiet for a moment. No, he looked back at the bay. I figured as much, she sighed, brushing blonde strands out of her eyes. What are you then? He looked at her once again, a strange look in his eyes. Are you sure you want to know? Yes. You can't let anyone else know, he said firmly. He made her promise not to tell. She promised. I'm a pirate. You have got to be shitting me. Rika reeled and nearly fell right off the roof. Somehow the title pirate both fit him and didn't at the same time. She chalked it up to the double standards that now applied to Luffy. No way. Her body beginning to tremble. Luffy pouted like a child. You don't have to be scared. Swallowing, Rika pulled herself together. Why the hell are you a pirate? He gave her a half grin. When I was 7 years old, a pirate saved my life and gave me this hat. Her eyes flicked up to the worn-looking straw hat perched on his head. I promised him that I would meet him again someday to return it as a strong pirate. The words came naturally from his mouth, and Rika had no trouble believing them. She counted to 5 and decided that she needed to stop looking for similarities between the two Luffys and treat them like two separate people. She didn't know this man. Did you meet him again? She asked. Luffy nodded, smiling brightly. The dreadful atmosphere was finally beginning to lift. Shanks gave it back to me though, said I deserved it. Shanks? It can't possibly mean. Do you mean Akagami Shanks? Rika raised her eyebrows. Luffy nodded. Well shit, this man had connections. If you're a pirate, then why are you helping us? He frowned at her before smiling once again. They're going to give me lots of money to bring back, and you're also my only way home. That's when Rika realized they'd taken him from his nakama. He was a pirate, and apparently the strongest man in the world. His crew would be pissed. She resolved to help Vegapunk find a way for him to get him back in, or send a message to his friends that he was just fine. Tell me about your crew, Rika said. She inferred that he was the captain. Luffy began to describe the different people he traveled with. A directionally impaired swordsman, a money-loving navigator, a lying sharpshooter, a womanizer cook, a reindeer doctor, an archaeologist, assassin, a cyborg shipwright, and a perverted afro-skeleton. Rika was amazed. She laughed along with the pirate, finally feeling at ease around him. And he wasn't such a bad person for a pirate either. Maybe the world wasn't as cut and dry as she'd made it out to be after all. Maybe there was hope for them too. Vegapunk fidgeted nervously under his superior's gaze. Sengoku watched the elder man like a hawk, eyes never wavering or shifting from the panicking man. The silence was thick and stifling, both only waiting for the inevitable pin drop to break the awkwardness. "You've been hiding something from us, Vegapunk," Sengoku slowly said, making sure that Vegapunk comprehended the pressure he put behind the words. He, being the mad and ingenious scientist that he was, completely understood and nodded after a short pause. I have," Vegapunk said, giving a loud sigh before he flopped down in a chair in front of the desk. He had been caught red-handed, so he might as well spill the beans. "It was me who stole all the light fixtures from—" "Damn it, this isn't about that," Sengoku shouted, a dangerous tick mark appearing on his forehead. Vegapunk laughed. Joking aside, he knew perfectly well that now was the time to explain. There wasn't really a need to keep secrets from the Fleet Admiral, after all. All right, I'll be serious. Tell me what you know about Monkey D. Luffy," Sengoku said, reminding himself of who he was talking to. "Well, first of all," Vegapunk began, "I should explain that I don't know the whole of it myself. I contacted myself from numerous worlds until I got lucky." I explained the situation and he suggested Luffy. Sengoku raised his eyebrows. "Really? It was that simple?" "Oh, no, it's a mite more complicated. Their world is in an era of peace, but most people don't really recognize that it's peaceful. Monkey D. Luffy, the undisputed strongest man in their world, is no hero." "I'm afraid I don't understand," Sengoku frowned, thinking over the possibilities. Those words struck a chord of uneasiness deep inside him, and the reports and demonstration of the boy's power were enough to draw concern. "He's dangerous, Sengoku. Risk follows him constantly, wherever he goes. He's saved thousands of lives, but he's ruined just as many. Can you comprehend that, Sengoku? No one has experienced anything like it since Roger still sailed the seas." A sparkle of excitement and imagination twinkled in the elder's eyes. "So he's not a Marine?" "No, not by a long shot." Vegapunk chuckled and shook his head. "That's what separates our two worlds, the occupation of Monkey D. Luffy. He's a catalyst, that one. My other self told me that he's unpredictable, so we have to be careful. Right now he's under the impression that we are his only way home to his nakama, who have let us borrow him, by the way, and this puts us in a position of leverage. However, it's a dangerously precarious position, and if we were to make one wrong move he could and would annihilate us." "Why does he think that we're the only option?" Sengoku asked. Vegapunk grimaced. "Well, I sort of outright lied to his face. His nakama know he's here, but he doesn't know that they know. We can also send him back any time." "Idiot. If he's really as powerful as you say, why on earth didn't you tell him? He'll try not to cause as much of a ruckus, which is good for us. He's notorious for stirring up trouble." Sengoku massaged his temples, feeling an oncoming migraine. The situation had just become a lot more complicated. Rika fumbled with a tall stack of papers and folders, on her way to deliver them to her superior. Her glasses were askew and her nose itched terribly, but she couldn't put down the mountain of paperwork. Recent events had spurred a movement in headquarters, and everyone was feeling the strain. Her thoughts were turbulent and chaotic. Questions droned on like bees, battering her repeatedly and not helping her in the slightest. For every question answered, two more would take its place. She was so lost in her thoughts that when she rounded the corner she bumped into someone, sending all her pages to the floor. "Sorry," she squeaked, not even bothering to check who it was. Immediately her focus was on the things scattered across the floor. Irritation tickled at the edges of her mind. She was very tired. "Watch where you're going next time," a deep voice barked in annoyance. Rika glanced upwards and spluttered in surprise. It was none other than Admiral Akainu. She jumped to her feet, giving a quick salute. "Yes, sir." Before she could return to collecting her things, Akainu grabbed her by the arm and looked into her eyes. "You're friends with that Luffy brat, right?" Well, I guess." It was true she was friends with their Luffy, but the other one she wasn't so sure. At that point she had no idea which one he was talking about. "What do you know, girl? You have got to know something about that bastard. There isn't something right about him." A wave of panic overcame Rika, and though she tried to hide it, her expression was painfully obvious. The grip on her arm tightened, and his thick fingers heated up. Fear accompanied the panic as he shook her small form savagely. "Tell me what you know." He was definitely talking about the other Luffy. The burden of knowing that Luffy was a pirate suddenly became very heavy as she looked up into the Admiral's face. He was an idealistic juggernaut that cruelly enforced his viewpoint. To him all pirates were scum, and those scum had to be killed. Though she didn't know him that well, and even though he was a pirate, she couldn't bear to see him dead. "Tell me," he shouted, and tears sprung to her eyes. She wrenched her bruised arm out of his grip and ran, not caring about the lost paperwork any longer. She would tell no one of what had just occurred. "Though, hold still, damn it," Rika fumed as Luffy pouted childishly. After the incident concerning Crocodile, Luffy had sort of unofficially become a part of their military in some people's eyes, so of course he had been sent for a general physical and checkup. Rika was drawing blood, and the boy simply refused to cooperate. You stick it in too hard. Luffy stuck out his tongue at the young doctor, who growled in return. Shut up, she replied, feeling a vague sense of déjà vu. Sometimes he was too much like the Luffy that she knew. It made her inexplicably sad. This man, this pirate, was so strong, had gone through so much pain and agony, was hated simply for being born, and yet his life was filled with joy. The way he spoke told volumes. He loved being alive. He loved being a pirate. Their Luffy had only spoken once of being a pirate. Only once, and it surprised both Rika and Toma, the only two witnesses. It was just a childhood dream, he said, when he thought the world was just peaky and such adventure was real. Rika hated that conversation. The way that he spoke that time was nothing like the boy she knew. He sounded regretful, as though he still longed for that childhood fantasy. And here he was, from a different world, with different abilities and friends, living his dream. She hoped that the two wouldn't meet. The end result would be disastrous. Rika huffed. Hold out your arm, I still can't find a vein. No, I don't wanna. For the love of God, don't make this harder than it should be, she shouted. He laughed it off, but finally complied. She grabbed his arm and searched for the telltale blue mark. When she couldn't find one on the inside of his elbow, she turned to his hand and examined the back of it. His knuckles had thick calluses. With a small smile, she finally found a vein and carefully inserted the sterile needle. Luffy wrinkled his nose at the smell of the antibacterial wipes, but otherwise didn't complain. There, that wasn't so hard, was it? Rika said as she carefully labeled the sample before placing it in the tray. By the way, why does your skin feel rubbery? The pirate laughed, surprising her. He continued to grin as he answered, I ate a devil fruit when I was little, the gamu gamu no mai. I'm a rubber man. That certainly explained a lot. You're made of rubber? Rika asked. Yeah. Luffy hooked his finger on the corner of his mouth and pulled. The skin stretched, extending farther than should be possible. When he let go, it quickly snapped back into place. Whoa, Rika grinned. She hadn't yet had the chance to examine a devil fruit user's ability up close before. How far can you stretch? Why don't I show you? He chuckled. Just go up to the roof tonight. All right. Her eyes sparkled, and she could feel the stirrings of an adventurous spirit from deep within her. This man's optimism was contagious. Rika sneezed when she opened the door up to roof. It was a crisply chill night and the moon was bright and plump, illuminating the city below in a silvery wash. He was already there, wearing a sweater temporarily borrowed. His straw hat waved in the wind from its place on his back, hanging from his neck by a string. When she stepped out onto the roof, he immediately turned his head to look at her. He slowly stood up, careful not to fall off, and approached her. You ready? Rika nodded, undeniably curious. She wouldn't admit it, but she was very excited to see more of his abilities. Yeah, with a shishishi, he turned around, scanning the city with a smile. Climb onto my back and hold tight. A frown marked her confusion, but she did it nevertheless. He made sure that her grip was strong enough before he singled out a single spot further down. He sent his arm stretching into the distance, where it latched onto a flagpole. Realization and horror dawned on Rika, but it was far too late. With a scream on her part, both of them were launched at breakneck speeds. She was sure she was strangling him, especially since he was trying to loosen her death grip on his neck. That had probably been the most reckless and stupid thing she had ever been a part of. Are you an idiot? We could have died. He laughed and made sure that she wasn't about to suffocate him before launching them off in another random direction in similar fashion. Very soon Rika found herself enjoying the exhilarating rush that it brought, even if she was sure she was going to have a heart attack. The wind whipped across her face and through her hair, the cold stinging her skin. She could feel her heart beat against her ribs. It was the most amazing experience she'd ever had. When they returned to the roof, she punched him in the face for endangering their lives. But as she walked back inside, followed by his laughter, she couldn't help but smile. Garp let out a deep breath, watching the morning fog clear as they approached Marineford. The sea was a murky green, the sky mostly clear. Fishing boats dotted the coastline, a few of which he waved to on their way in. A loud explosion alerted Garp of his grandson's arrival long before he actually showed, running from a couple of angry cooks. As soon as the boy had lost those on his tail, he went to his grandfather. There were dark circles under Garp's eyes, showing that he hadn't had much sleep on the voyage. Luffy was incredibly restless during the whole thing, excitement coursing through his little body from the prospect of a grand and important mission that had been described to him from others. And because he was restless, he made everyone else tired and cranky. They had found nothing, just as expected. I can't wait to tell Rika and Toma about what we saw, Luffy said, excitement still evident in his tone. He leaned over the railing, silently willing Marineford to come into view, to emerge from the fog and announce the end of their seemingly endless mission. Slowly but surely the fog completely cleared and they could see headquarters in all its glory. The massive stone structure was still awe-inspiring. Garp found himself smiling as they made their way into the harbor. There were people waiting for them on the shore. They docked rather quickly, and Garp and Luffy were the first ones off the boat. As much as he loved the sea, Garp couldn't help but feel grateful that he was back on dry land. He slowly breathed in the salty air and watched the sun hit the sparkling white stone. Vice Admiral Garp. Garp turned his head to look at who was calling out to him. It was his colleague, Vice Admiral Stainless. "Welcome back." They clasped arms and laughed good-naturedly in a display of camaraderie. "I hope you guys didn't do anything too rash in my absence. I read about Crocodile." Stainless looked perturbed suddenly, the exact opposite of what Garp had been expecting, actually. "About that, you didn't do anything stupid, right?" The frown made its way into Garp's voice. The nagging feeling in the back of his mind was suddenly brought to the forefront as he examined his fellow Vice Admiral, who was looking a little sheepish. "Vegapunk found a solution to our problem with the war." "Oh shit, this can't be good. What's going on?" Garp demanded. "Vegapunk pulled someone from an alternate reality into ours. We didn't think it was possible, but it's true. He made a deal with Sengoku, but we wanted to be sure it was legitimate, so we sent him off to capture Crocodile." "Are you saying he defeated the Shichibukai?" Garp trusted Stainless, and if he said someone had come from another world he would believe it, no matter how unbelievable the claim was. "Yeah, I was there." The man shook his head. "It was scary, honestly. Vegapunk told us that he's the strongest man in his world. But it is one thing to hear about it and another to experience it. The kid knocked all of us out with Haki and then beat Crocodile within an inch of his life. That was impressive." "Did you say he was a kid?" Garp asked. "Yeah, you see, that's the thing. You're not going to believe who it is." "Tell me." "It's your grandson." Luffy pushed through the crowd, searching for his two best friends. A wide smile spread across his face when he caught sight of Toma, who was also searching the crowd for his longtime friend. "Toma," Luffy called, running towards him. The smaller boy looked over at the approaching Marine, but he didn't jump for joy or even smile. Instead, he looked worried, even sick. "Luffy, how was your trip?" Toma asked, twitching nervously. "It was great. I even saw some whales." "Fantastic. Listen, Luffy, I have to tell you something. This is really important." The smile slid off of Luffy's face at Toma's tone of voice. He nodded, serious for once. He listened as Toma quickly explained the project, how Vegapunk pulled the strongest man through from another world and how that same man defeated Crocodile. "Sugoi," Luffy whispered under his breath, already indescribably excited. His whole body was trembling in anticipation now, longing to actually meet this incredible individual. A grin once again spread across his face, but this only seemed to make Toma worried. "Where is he?" "Luffy, that's the thing." "Boy," a voice called out, and the two of them turned to see Rika coming towards them. Luffy's heart stopped beating for a moment when he caught a glimpse of who was trailing after her. His breath caught in his throat, eyes widening in shock. He suddenly wanted to run, to hide, and to curl into a little ball and cry. All sounds faded as he watched himself walk towards them. It was him. It was him. "Toma," Luffy rasped in a hoarse voice. "What's wrong?" The other man turned his purple eyes towards him, expression worried. "That's him, Toma, from those dreams a couple months ago." He swallowed thickly. Toma's eyes widened when he realized what his friend was telling him. "He'll kill us all." Luffy watched on nervously as the other focused on him. Black eyes saturated in something between curiosity and disgust. They unconsciously merged into one, and the strongest man curled his lip. The Marine swallowed, trying to will his body to stop shaking. He was reminded of the coppery tang of blood and nearly retched. His stomach twisted and turned into knots, bile threatening bubble over. Luffy watched as the muscles in his counterpart's body tensed, like a wild cat ready to pounce. His blood ran cold when he realized that he was utterly terrified. That was no dream, he thought in dread, the nightmare from months prior flashing through his mind's eye. The images were still crystal clear. It wasn't a dream, and instead had been an event so momentous that ripples of discord had bled into their world. It was the memory of the man currently standing before him. He could vaguely hear Rika and Toma trying to speak, shrill squawking, but nothing penetrated the sudden tension stretching between the two. All noises were currently mute and he was as good as deaf. His attention was solely on his double. The man's eyes gleamed dangerously. A straw hat hung off his neck, which surprisingly didn't look out of place, like it was meant to be there. They were both the same height, but for some reason Luffy felt like he was looking up at the intimidating figure. That gaze pinned him to the spot, dissecting him and looking into his very soul. An especially intense shiver passed down his spine, which his friends and his other self did not fail to notice. Someone touched his elbow. "Luffy, are you okay?" It was Rika, who, while trying to hide it, was actually incredibly worried, and not just for her friend. The pressure between the two had thickened once again, to the point that it was suffocating, and those in the immediate area were starting to feel uncomfortable. It was like the other Luffy could hear his thoughts. He shuddered again and took a step back. He needed to get out of there now. The man's eyes sharpened and focused intently on his other self, as though to say running away. Luffy scowled, forcing his body to still. If he ran, then he would regret it for the rest of his life. He stood his ground, and even dared to push back against that unstoppable force. He's a monster. Something seemed to snap, and they were suddenly at each other's throats. They sent punches and kicks, and both were on the ground growling and hissing and yelling. Luffy felt all the air in his lungs desert him as a powerful punch connected with his stomach. He grit his teeth and fought back, going for the other's eyes. The sandals of the other scraped across his shins, while Luffy was trying to get as many hits in as possible. Red filled their vision as they attacked with wild abandon, simply brawling and ignoring any form of past training. Luffy bit down on something hard enough to break the skin. A calloused hand found its way around his throat, but the adrenaline momentarily let him forget about needing air. Those mocking and challenging eyes made him sick to his stomach. His heart was in his throat, beating quickly and heavily. He managed to kick the man in the chest, before attempting to twist him in a chokehold. The grip on his neck broke, and Luffy was nearly thrown back when air filled his chest. Black spots dotted the edges of his vision, but the only thing he could see was the monster, snarling savagely. And then someone was pulling him away from his double, tugging strongly and dragging him to his feet. Someone did the same with the other, who was still hissing and spitting and longing to attack. Luffy was in a similar state. Intense hatred welled up inside him, willing him to attack the monster that was currently shoving off Toma. Luffy heaved, his breathing labored, simply itching to fight again. The double wiped the corner of his mouth, where a trickle of blood was escaping past his lips. Luffy was skilled in haki, which was probably the reason he was still alive after years of living at headquarters. His punches would leave marks, no matter how strong the fucker was. Rika let go of him slowly, as to ensure that he wouldn't jump after the other one. A smirk slowly spread across the stranger's face, before he let out a chuckle. He then turned around and left, hands in his pockets and completely ignoring Toma, who tried to get him to stop. Luffy glowered at his back until he disappeared into the crowd. Luffy began to regain his hearing, and took notice of Rika, who was trying to catch his attention. "Sorry," he said, gaze shifting to her worried face. "Are you hurt at all?" she asked, glancing anxiously at his neck. There would definitely be some intense bruising later. "I'm fine, but I got to ask, why the hell is he here?" he growled, not angry at her but at the crazy scientist that was Toma's superior. Toma answered for her, a frown on his face. "He's the one we brought through." Luffy scowled even more, wishing that he could find and attack his other self again. "He can't be trusted," he hissed. Surprisingly, Rika looked sad at that, and at his questioning glance she fidgeted uncomfortably. "He's not so bad once you get to know him. Please, Luffy, just give him a chance." Forcing himself to calm down and not lash out at his best friend, he slowly let out a breath through his nose and replied, "That guy, he's a murderer." With that, Luffy passed by his friends, who watched him leave in the opposite direction of his counterpart, equally worried for both of them and the future itself. Garp was mad. No, that simple word is not enough to completely encompass the severity of Garp's rage. Words like livid and incensed may fit better, but they too are inadequate to portray the fury leaking from every pore in the elderly Marine's body. His face had gone from bright red to purple, and his throat was sore from all the yelling he was doing. His body was under extreme strain. His poor heart was working overtime just to keep him on his feet. He was doing more talking than breathing, but he showed no signs of pausing anytime soon. Everyone but the subject of his anger had flinched and subtly fled the room, not wanting to be near the exploding volcano that was Vice Admiral Garp. Garp was really mad. Sengoku, who had expected as much from him, sat patiently and waited for the roaring fire to die down until all that remained were the smoldering embers. Only rank and a certain respect kept Garp from physically lashing out at his superior, but that didn't include his sharp tongue. Slowly but surely Garp stopped verbally abusing Sengoku and sated himself by muttering colorful curses under his breath, pacing back and forth across the length of the office. Still, Sengoku waited for the inevitable question. "Why?" Garp finally said, looking up at his friend. His eyebrows were drawn together and dark circles under those tired eyes made the Vice Admiral look his actual age for once. Sengoku gave a heavy sigh, the kind that only people who've seen all the world's horrors could make. He too looked tired and old, but strong just the same. "Whether we like it or not, we need his help, Garp. Of all people in how many worlds, why did you bring Luffy?" Garp's shoulders slumped, and he slowly took a seat. The elderly man massaged his temples, as though fighting off the mother of all headaches. "I honestly don't know myself. Vegapunk, or the Vegapunks have some sort of hidden agenda. But my gut is telling me that having that boy here will ultimately cause more good than harm." Garp took the information silently, scowling even more. "What are you going to do now?" Sengoku gave a wry smile, surprising Garp. "I'm going to send him after Blackbeard." Blackbeard? Garp's eyes widened, and a natural instinct to protect his grandson filled him. He knew that this other Luffy had to be far more powerful than any of them would be able to handle. But that didn't stop him from worrying about the boy's safety. He was going to go up against one of the Yonkou, and on top of that one with an insanely strong devil fruit. Apparently that kid has some experience in dealing with that bastard. At the moment he's our best shot. Let me go with him then, Garp said, closing his eyes and running a hand through his hair. Sengoku studied the man, eyes searching his face for his motives. He then gave a good-natured chuckle and nodded his head. If you insist. You should take our Luffy too. Both of the old men gave a sigh and wondered where their world was going. Murderer, Rika frowned, her heart hammering in her chest. Her skin had gone clammy, and any sign of hunger that she may have had completely disappeared. Toma opened his mouth to say something, but decided against it. I'm a pirate. Wouldn't that make sense then? Rika didn't want to think that her friend, from any world, had it in him to do that. So, if it was true, then what had driven this other Luffy to commit such a horrific act? You should go after him, Toma said, nudging her in the direction that their Luffy had gone. Her heart dropped again. She knew that it was a bad idea to bring them together, but she hadn't expected such an outcome. For a moment the intensity between those two had been matched, and Rika had found herself paralyzed in fear. You shouldn't have to be afraid of your best friend. Toma looked helpless as he stared at her. Both of them were starting to feel the strain of being right in the middle of the crazy situation. Yeah, Rika said meekly before starting after her friend. Toma sadly watched her go. Luffy felt a familiar shiver pass up and down his spine. After becoming the Pirate King and the undisputed strongest man in the world, he still felt a little bit of childlike fear concerning his grandfather. This was true even now. His sensing abilities had evolved to the point that he could subconsciously tell when people were near and what their intent was. So when the familiar aura of that terrifying man approached, the Pirate King broke out into a cold sweat. It happened fast though, and as he was previously deep in thought, he did not have the chance to dodge. He clutched his throbbing head after the punch was received. Oh, what the hell? Eyes watering, he looked back at his other self's grandfather. You stubborn brat, Garp shouted, evidently annoyed at the familiar reaction. Luffy shot him an irritated glare as he rubbed his skull. He was mildly surprised to see his grandfather, but even more surprised to see that he was still a Marine. He then recalled the reason that his own grandfather had retired, and stopped that train of thought before it could carry him further. So, he guessed he wasn't so surprised after all. Garp still smelled of salt water, so Luffy deducted that he had been on some sort of mission with this world's Luffy. His teeth still hurt a little at that thought. That Marine version of him could throw a good punch. He certainly wasn't too happy at that Luffy's immediate reaction, but there was a look in his eye, like he knew something he wasn't supposed to know. This other Luffy pissed him off, but he was curious at the same time. You're coming with me to hunt Blackbeard, Garp said, bringing the Pirate King out of his little internal monologue. Luffy looked up at Garp, frowning slightly. He wasn't surprised about the news, but a thought tugged at the corner of his attention. Wasn't Jai-Chan Roger's rival or something? He didn't want to know what would happen if Garp discovered that Luffy had also taken the title of Pirate King, especially since this world's Luffy was somehow a Marine. How did that happen anyway? He wanted to know, damn it. Luffy gave a nod before straightening to his full height again. He was still small in stature compared to the elderly Marine, but that wasn't as much of a concern as when he was still a teenager. A grin tugged at his mouth as he remembered the aftermath of Anai's lobby. That was when he first found out that Dragon was his father. Garp seemed to notice something strange, which once again disrupted Luffy's thoughts. The Pirate King's eyes widened when the old man scrutinized the straw hat dangling from its string. A scowl spread across the Vice Admiral's face, and once again Luffy flushed with a nostalgic fear. His grandfather was terrifying. Where'd you get that hat? I don't know what you're talking about. He gave a small whistle and averted his eyes, once again falling prey to his terrible lying abilities. He visibly winced when Garp let loose a low rumble. Like he somewhat expected, Garp grabbed him by his collar and shook him for all he was worth. Don't lie to me, you ungrateful brat, he roared. Luffy's ears rung and he began to feel dizzy, so he decided that it was just easier to tell him now, as Garp would somehow shake it out of him later. As Shanks gave it to me. Garp dropped the boy, suddenly horrified. He was silent for all of 5 seconds before. You mean Akagami Shanks? Luffy gave a small nod and rubbed his backside, where he had fallen on the ground. He saved my life when I was 7. Wow, that sure brought back memories. That was what, 17 years ago? Garp's gaze darkened considerably. What happened after that? You brought me to Daten. What Luffy didn't say made much more of an impact than what he did say. Either way, he knew he was in for a world of hurt if he stuck around, so he did the next best thing and booked it before Garp could properly process his own thoughts. Luffy was an idiot, but time and trial had given him small pearls of wisdom. When Rika found Luffy, she did the first thing that came naturally. She punched him in the face. The expression he was making pissed her off to new levels. He looked so uncharacteristically pathetic that it was revolting. This new funk he was in needed to end, so she solved the problem the only way she knew how. What the hell, Rika? Luffy shouted from where he'd fallen on the floor, rubbing his now bruised cheek. He would probably get a black eye too. You're an idiot, she sighed and shook her head. As an afterthought she added, "Both of you." Luffy snarled at the mention of his double, but when Rika gave him a sharp look he wisely backed off. The young man gave a sigh of his own, rising to his feet and dusting off his pants. "Are you mad at me?" "Yes," she said. Rika stepped closer to him, and he flinched, but she only examined the bruises on his neck. They were turning a nasty shade of blue, with a sickly tinge of green around the edges. They dipped below the collar of his shirt and wrapped around his entire neck, covering his collarbones and one of his shoulders. "He did quite a number on you," she said quietly, prodding lightly at them. Luffy winced. "Yeah, well," he looked away from her, feeling ashamed. Rika's eyes widened suddenly, and she prodded lower at his ribcage. Luffy gritted his teeth at the sudden sharp pain there. "I think you may have broken a rib. Or 3, she said in concern. "I hope he has too," Luffy blurted without thinking about it. He cried out when Rika pressed down on the wound in her annoyance. "Stop doing that. You do realize that while you come from different worlds, he's still you." Luffy snorted, "He's not me." Rika gave a small smile and tucked a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. "I think you'd be surprised how similar you two are. Although I will admit that you're also very different." He pouted childishly and stared at her intently. "How do you know that?" "I've actually had the chance to talk with him." "Which you didn't bother to do," Rika accused, poking one of her fingers into his chest, where he wasn't injured. "I've already enough of what he's done." Luffy frowned seriously. "What do you mean?" She blinked in surprise. There was a flash of something in his eyes, something akin to fear and horror, but also an acute understanding of something that may have flipped his world. It made Rika feel uneasy. "I had a dream a couple of months ago, but I think it was actually his memory. I've never seen so much blood in my life." "Blood?" Luffy nodded. "It was like I was actually living it, too. Even now when I recall it I suddenly feel like I want to kill someone." Rika was shocked, but it somehow made sense. Their worlds were connected in more ways than one. "The other Luffy is kind of scary when he's angry," she admitted. Luffy's head whipped around to stare at her, his eyes the size of plates. He threw Garth right through a brick wall with one hand. And he wasn't paying much attention either. Luffy raised his eyebrows. "Seriously?" "Yeah, well, nobody really believed the story at first, seeing as the whole project had been kept secret." The Marine then chuckled. "That bastard probably got what was coming to him." Rika gave a small, exasperated laugh. "Probably. What else did he do?" Luffy's eyes were now wide with curiosity, something that Rika was very familiar with. She gave a small smile and slowly told her best friend of his counterpart's ability to eat, his devil fruit powers, and how that both of them couldn't sing to save their lives. Rika was suddenly very, very grateful for her friend's return. While the other Luffy had been kind and quite entertaining at times, she knew this one better. Overcome with fond feelings, she embraced the slightly taller man in a hug, one that took him by surprise. "I'm glad you're back," she said with a smile. Luffy smiled too, but it was strained because she was squeezing his ribs, which should probably be treated quickly. "Yeah, me too. Rika, you're hurting me." "Sorry," she squeaked, jumping away from her friend. They stared at each other before bursting into laughter, which was broken up again when Luffy heaved, clutching his side. She had missed him terribly, whether she knew it or not, because he was theirs. "You have a black eye." "I know. It was Rika, right?" "Yep." Luffy couldn't help but crack a smile. That girl reminded him of Nami somewhat, but in a different way. He was actually sort of glad she wasn't a carbon copy of his navigator, or else he would probably be sporting a black eye too. Well, maybe not one that showed up, but one all the same. It was really hard to bruise when you were made of rubber. He closed his eyes and momentarily let himself imagine their voices and presences instead of the large amount of Marines scurrying around, and pretend he wasn't on a warship and instead on Thousand Sunny. But he couldn't ignore his counterpart, who was now staring at him strangely. Both of them were seated on the frontal cannon that served as a temporary replacement for his special seat on Sunny's figurehead. After their initial fight, both of them had backed down from trying to kill each other and instead watched each other closely. Very closely, it seemed. Luffy knew that the Marine watched him when he was trying to sleep. "You know something about me," Luffy said to the Marine version of himself, feeling a little smug when the other's eyes widened. He huffed and looked away from the pirate. "We're almost the same person." Luffy gave a shishishi of laughter, not minding the response. However, even though he was laughing, he was actually being very serious, something that the other Luffy knew too, and knew it well. It wasn't long before Monkey began to describe their transferred memories. If anything, Luffy's smile grew wider as he thought of the aftermath, but it was also sadder when he thought of the actual fight and events leading up to it. "You killed him," Monkey glared at his counterpart. The Marine had grown up to be quite similar to Luffy morally, with some changes here and there because of his Marine influence. The Pirate King was far more selfish. "He fell," was Luffy's only answer. "You pushed him." He didn't answer at all then. He wouldn't answer. He was almost in denial. But in his heart he knew he did push his half-alive opponent into that gaping chasm, and damn it did it feel good, which was why he wouldn't admit it out loud. He had his revenge. He didn't regret it. He was so very selfish. Luffy leaned back, resting his elbows against the warm metal of the huge cannons. It almost burned to touch, but the cool sea breeze was a nice contrast, so he didn't mind. His hat shaded his eyes against the bright sunlight, and he could practically feel the sea in his skin. Everything was peaceful, which was rare on the Grand Line, but he didn't complain. Why did you become the strongest in your world? Luffy smirked now and answered cheekily. Because I could, before sticking his tongue out. The Marine punched him in the arm. That's not what I meant, Monkey whined. Luffy shook his head. No, that's why I did it, because I could, because I want to protect my nakama, and because I wanted to be free. Are you then? I am. What about you? The Marine Luffy grimaced. I just want to make Jai-chan proud. Luffy made a face before fully reclining onto his back, placing his hat over his nose and crossing his arms comfortably behind his head. What was that for? Jai-chan is scary. Monkey laughed, silently acknowledging that, when I was little he would come every few weeks and tell us that we were going to be Marines. He kept throwing me into all these dangerous places, nearly killed me. Us? Monkey inquired between snorts of laughter. This seemed to be the first time they engaged in a civil conversation without spitting insults. Me and my brothers. Monkey was instantly jealous. He hadn't grown up with siblings, only the Marines, who until he was 16 were all older or much older than him. But he also guessed that he had been treated like a younger brother for the most part. That is, until he got stronger than them. What are they like? One died years ago and I thought the other had died when we were kids. The Marine couldn't see his double's face, but he could hear the sadness in his voice. Now he felt guilty. Sorry, he mumbled before looking out at the horizon again. There was an awkward silence for a few minutes, in which neither moved nor spoke. Monkey watched the seagulls following the ship. The weather had seemed to stabilize, which meant that they were probably approaching an island. I wanted to make Shanks proud too. Monkey startled before looking down at the pirate, Shanks. Thankfully neither of them was the sharpest of wits, and therefore Monkey did not make the connection between the name Shanks and the name Akagami Shanks. He came and visited my hometown lots. He was the coolest. I always asked him to take me with him, but he never did. How old were you then? 7. Monkey had been living at Marineford for a year and a half by that time. He lost his arm to save my life, and then he left for good, but not before I promised him that I would be the strongest. He sounds like someone I'd like to meet. The Marine smiled, but Luffy didn't say anything. Why do you want to make Jai-chan proud? Luffy asked. He'd never really been that close to his grandfather, but after he became Pirate King the two of them had made contact again, years after Ace's death. That was the first time he'd seen his grandfather cry. Well, 'cause he's family, his only family. While Luffy had never grown really close to his grandfather because of an underlying fear and the influence of his older brothers, the Marine version of him started to see the old man as a sort of role model. He wanted to be like his grandfather, both kind and merciful, but at the same time able to beat the strongest opponents. The Pirate King sadly knew the truth about Garp, but he didn't dare mention it. Do you want to be strong? Monkey was taken aback by that question. Well, duh. Luffy wasn't convinced. No, it wasn't that he wanted to be strong, or at least not for the reasons that Luffy wanted to be strong. It was exactly what his first answer had been. He just wanted to make Jai-chan proud. He just wanted to be loved and accepted. Luffy was sure that his counterpart had no real ambition to reach the top of the ladder. He suspected that helping civilians was also his thing. Are you happy? Yeah, that was good enough for him. You want to get some food? Luffy asked, getting to his feet and brushing his shorts off. He held out his hand, which the Marine took, and hauled him to his feet. Monkey nodded, grinning innocently. This guy wasn't so bad. They were, in essence, the same person after all. The two of them raided the kitchens, and when they both ran for their lives as angry cooks chased them, Luffy shouting something about them being slower than someone called Sanji, they both came to a small understanding of one another. Sure, they were both going to fight and bicker because of their differences, but that was okay. Monkey knew that Rika was right. Rika was always right. And don't go running off, all right. Both of them nodded simultaneously, the uncanny mimicry freaking Garp out. The two Luffys, while different in their own way, were still scarily similar, to the point that Garp was concerned that he wouldn't be able to tell the difference if they really put in an effort to act exactly the same. There were subtle differences, of course, which Garp was glad for. The most obvious one was the straw hat that the alternate Luffy stubbornly clung to, and after some awkward and amusing instances where everyone was unsure what to call the other one, the boy suggested that they just call him Mugiwara, after the hat itself. That hat worried Garp. He knew whom that hat used to belong to. There were also some other physical distinctions. Mugiwara's hair was slightly longer, and he had glaringly obvious scars on his body. There was one right under his left eye, which Garp concluded that he didn't want to know the cause of. A nasty burn scar on his chest and a deep, jagged cut on his back that went from his left shoulder to his right hip that everyone had seen on one of the hot days when nobody bothered putting on a shirt. And the most puzzling thing was the tattoo on his right arm, just below his shoulder and wrapping around the bicep. They were characters that Garp couldn't identify, ancient in origin and obviously meaning something. But Garp couldn't fathom what was so important that the boy had it permanently added to his skin. Garp watched as both boys, men, shot each other a glance before rushing for the door, pushing and shoving each other aside like they were rivals or brothers. Again, this freaked Garp out. They wouldn't stop fighting one moment, and the next moment they were practically linked telepathically. It was starting to drive the crew half mad. The Vice Admiral sighed. They were stopping to ask around for information. It had been 2 weeks since leaving headquarters, and what a strange fortnight it was. They'd only caught a whiff of the elusive Yonkou, but it was better than nothing, he supposed. They were slowly but surely closing in, and when Teach discovered that they were after him, there was no doubt that he'd be interested in finding out why. The meeting was inevitable at this point. He hoped that his alternate self's grandson, the grandson that had grown up with mountain bandits and most likely Porcus DAs, the one he hadn't been there for, would indeed be able to deal with Blackbeard, or so help him he would forever regret it. Garp didn't show it in obvious ways, but he did love his grandson very much. Luffy was impressed. He was rather hopeful that this would work, and it seemed as though Mugiwara could pull it off. This was the first time his double had come with them to ask for Blackbeard's whereabouts. He demanded to go because he was bored out of his mind. The straw hat-wearing man had undergone a bit of a transformation. Luffy wasn't someone extremely famous, but he wasn't a nobody either. The whole their identical thing also didn't help, and everyone mutually agreed that coming up with a bullshit story about how Mugiwara was his long-lost twin brother or something wouldn't cut it. Anyone with half a brain could tell that it went past being identical twins. So they had dressed Mugiwara up, careful to hide his face. It was an autumn island, which was good, because they made his counterpart wear a shirt with a hood that was probably a little too big for him. If it was a summer island, he would probably overheat or something. It's itchy, Mugiwara whined as he scratched at his arms and sides. Luffy frowned in sympathy. You're wearing that if you want to come, Coulson. The elected supervisor for the two of them said. He was a very serious man, who obviously was not keen on the idea of babysitting 2 overgrown children. It was little known that Luffy was technically a higher rank than those in their little party. He hardly ever used the title though, and sometimes even forgot that he possessed it. The Marine was happy to let the others take charge, because that wasn't what he wanted. Mugiwara looked like a civilian now. The coat hid his face and any obvious scars. Mugiwara also wasn't wearing shorts anymore, seeing as Luffy was, and they wanted to make as many differences as possible. But he still wore his sandals. The effect was just like they wanted. He looked like another person. Luffy slid in front of his double, looking hard at his face. It was shadowed, and if he didn't look at anyone directly, they wouldn't know the difference. Say something. Mugiwara gave him a dubious look before quickly commenting on how that the coat was still itchy. Luffy shook his head. You have to say it differently. We have the same voice. Realization dawned on his face before he began practicing. The other few Marines in their group tried not to laugh, but failed miserably. Both Luffys glared at them, which immediately shut them up. Are we ready to go yet? Coulson drawled, not impressed in the slightest. They stuck out their tongues at him before unceremoniously running off. The group of them wandered the streets of the city, asking ordinary people if there had been any suspicious activity or pirates. The citizens were friendly enough, but many of them had their minds elsewhere and didn't know much. But, of course, they always seemed to attract trouble. The old man was nervous, and he knew that Luffy could tell that he was nervous. The Marine frowned as he asked him the appropriate default questions, frowning when he realized that the man was hiding something. What do you know? Luffy asked finally, getting to the heart of the problem. Mugiwara looked at the old man sideways out of the corner of his eye. The man had been lurking on the sidelines the entire time, just watching and waiting. Please, mister. Luffy looked down into the big, watery doe eyes of a 5-year-old girl. She was on the verge of tears, something that tugged at Luffy's heart. He kneeled down, placing a reassuring hand on the top of her head. What's wrong? You can tell me. He gave his best trustworthy smile and watched as hope kindled in her eyes. There are pirates on the other side of the island. They took Papa, she pleaded. This caught his double's attention. Luffy ruffled her hair and stood up. Don't worry. I'll find him and bring him back. Okay. The little girl nodded, smiling through her tears. The old man, presumably her grandfather, ushered her inside before turning back to the duo. He seemed a little put out. Why'd you hide that? We don't need the Marine's help, he sneered, as though it was second nature. Sorry, Mugiwara chose that time to intervene, pushing forward and resting his elbows on the counter. Were you a pirate, Asen? We won't tell, we promise. The old man looked shocked for a moment before nodding. Luffy frowned, wondering how someone who obviously cared for their family could be a pirate, of all things. Mugiwara shot him a significant glance, and Luffy let the matter go. At least the old man was retired. My son's an inventor, but he can fix any kind of machine. They heard about it when they broke down here and took him away. I've been trying to get help. I'm far too old to fight anymore. Like he said, we'll help, Mugiwara said, motioning towards the Marine. The old man smiled and thanked him, taking his hand and shaking it. The two of them walked away with directions to the other side of the island. Come on, we have to head back to the others, Luffy said, dragging his other self behind him. Let's just go there right now, Mugiwara suggested. And what are we going to do if we beat them? They're pirates, they're going to be arrested. I'm not dragging all of them back by myself. Luffy stopped talking when he realized that he was now speaking to himself. The Marine looked back over his shoulder to see Mugiwara standing in front of the entrance to an alleyway. Oi, Mugiwara, don't just stop. He started running. Luffy growled before running after the other man. He was fast too. The Marine had a hard time catching up with him. Whatever the man had seen, obviously it was important. So it was either a lead or food, but they were passing all kinds of food stalls, so he doubted it was the latter. He dashed down the narrow streets, weaving through people and trying to keep the hooded man in sight at all times. Wait up, he called, watching as the other rushed around a corner. He followed suit, but was surprised when he crashed right into his back. What the hell? Luffy hissed from the ground, holding his nose, which had collided painfully with Mugiwara's shoulder. It was like the pirate couldn't even hear him. Luffy frowned before getting to his feet. He looked past his double, before his eyes widened and his blood ran cold. No way, the universe really liked to mess with him. There, on the ground, sleeping like a baby, sprawled awkwardly in the dust, was none other than Porcus D. Ace. Ace, he breathed. His heart paused in his chest. Blood drummed in his ears. He couldn't move, and he certainly didn't pay attention to the person that had just run into his back. He was more concerned about the man lying on the ground in front of him, in the exact same position as he had died in. It can't be. Oh, he knew it wasn't. He knew very well that it was this world's Ace, that it wasn't really his brother. His brother was dead. Luffy knew that all too well. Marineford came back to him and practically punched him in the face. The war, that horrible war that he had invaded before he was ready, when he wasn't strong enough to amount to the sheer power of those he opposed. That was the day he failed. Presumably at the mercy of one of his narcoleptic fits, the pirate snored loudly, a snot bubble sprouting from his nose, reminding Luffy of the situation. He needed to get Ace out of the street as soon as possible, because according to the insignia on the back of his jacket, this one was also a pirate. We have to turn him in. Luffy looked over at his double, completely dumbfounded. For a moment he'd forgotten that Monkey was even there. Never mind that he was a Marine. He looked back at Ace, before looking once again at Monkey, who now was giving him a similar confused look. Are you all right? Monkey asked hesitantly. Luffy didn't reply as he turned back to his brother's double. This one was older and dressed a little differently, but it was still unmistakably Ace. He rolled the man onto his back before hooking his hands under his armpits. What are you doing? Monkey demanded in a loud whisper, surprised at the very least. The Marine wasn't sure what was going on, but he knew that it was something strange and possibly not anything good. Whether his double had noticed or not, but Luffy was crying. Give me a hand here, Luffy said as he started to drag the pirate towards the back of the alley. Monkey opened his mouth to protest before deciding against it. The Marine grabbed Ace by the ankles, all the while shaking his head and hissing words about how they should just go find one of the others and grab some Kairoski cuffs before he woke up. Luffy looked at the different buildings before signaling out a single, abandoned-looking house just at the end of the row. There were no people in the tiny space between the houses, which both were thankful for as they carried their cargo into the designated building. They unceremoniously dropped him onto the kitchen floor, standing back to study the still sleeping pirate. I'll go get the others. You stay here and guard him. I doubt he'll get past you, Monkey said before turning towards the door. To his surprise, Luffy grabbed his elbow in a painfully tight grip. Cut it out. You'll cut off the blood flow. I'm not rubber like you. No, Luffy rumbled. The way that he spoke sent chills dancing up and down Monkey's spine. The Marine could feel all the hairs on his body stand up. Goosebumps crawled across the surface of his arms and legs, and for a moment he was reminded that men had nipples too. That was a voice that promised many things and not all of them good. Luffy was on the verge of breaking out into hysterics, and he really wasn't in the mood to deal with his other self. He grabbed the open door using his elastic abilities and slammed it shut. Only then did he let go of Monkey, but he fixed him a hard glare that kept him in place. He let loose a small amount of haki so that Monkey could feel exactly how serious he was. And indeed, the Marine took a few hesitant steps back as his will vainly tried to match the storm welling up inside his counterpart. Sit, Luffy commanded gruffly. Monkey obediently sat down in one of the chairs at the small table, mouth clamped shut and eyes wide. Luffy's gaze then swept over to Ace, and something flashed in his eyes, something dangerous. Monkey swallowed. He wasn't sure what was going to happen next. Luffy stood in the shadows, body trembling the entire while. His breathing was uneven and eyes still watery, drinking in Ace's features with manic urgency. He shivered, wondering how Ace's life was like without him in it. A wave of sour guilt washed over him when he remembered that he was the cause of his Ace's death. What was also was his fault. He was snapped out of his panic-stricken spiral of inner turmoil when Ace gave a loud groan and opened his eyes. The hell, where am I? He slurred groggily. A nameless emotion crashed into him, breaking past all his barriers. All the pent-up anger, self-loathing and resentment that had been hiding somewhere deep and dark inside the recesses of his heart burst forward in one explosive outpouring of malignant energy. Ace was good at what he did. He was fairly accustomed to being attacked as soon as he woke up, so he was just able to meet the attack before it met him. Fuck, did it hurt. He knows hacky, Ace realized all too late. Before he could even shake off the weariness of slumber, he was pinned to the floor in a position that he couldn't bleeding move in. He swore loudly, shouting every colorful curse under the rainbow, trying to get this maniac off of him. There was a cloud of dark energy surrounding his assailant, which Ace measured to being stronger than Whitebeard's when the old man was in a bad mood, hungry, and they'd run out of sake. This person, whoever he was terribly strong, strong enough that Ace didn't feel ashamed of being a little afraid. And then, to everyone's surprise, and maybe horror, Luffy started crying again. Luffy still wouldn't let Ace go as he hung his head. The tears sizzled off of Ace's exposed skin. He shook with sobs, muttering things like "you bastard" and "my fault" under his breath. Ace stopped, his brow crinkling as he wondered what was happening. It definitely wasn't a dream, that's for sure. There was a person, a small person, who was stronger than Whitebeard, sitting on him while crying. Is it just me or is something really wrong here? What the hell is going on? Who is this psychopath? Ace whispered to the other man in the room, who looked just as surprised and puzzled as he did. The Marine shrugged his narrow shoulders in confusion. Ace looked up at the hooded figure, vainly trying to make out more than just vague facial features. No such luck, so they both waited patiently for the sobbing man to calm down. And when he did, the grip on Ace loosened considerably. The pirate shoved him off before sitting up and giving him a good look at. The hood had fallen down, and Luffy looked a lot younger than he really was in that moment, sitting on his knees and wiping away thick, hot tears with his sleeves. That's when Ace realized that he looked just like the other person sitting at the table. The fuck? His gaze switched from one to the other, taking note of one's casual clothing and straw hat and the other's loose marine uniform. Were they here to arrest him? If so, he was probably screwed because the kid bawling in front of him could very well kick his ass. Luffy started blubbering uncontrollably. "T's so great to see you, even if it's not really you. But you look just like him. I miss you so much. You used to be so much politer. Why are you here? Damn it, you bastard. Why the hell did you have to do that?" And so on and so forth. Sometime during the stuttered speech, the kid had grabbed at his chest, fisting the black fabric tightly in his hand while the other continued to remove salty tears and snot from his face. Ace gave him a raised eyebrow, wholly unsure how to deal with what was going on. After a minute of awkward rambling, Ace finally shouted, "Will you shut up?" Luffy immediately stopped, stared up at his older brother, eyes wide and still watery, biting his lip to stop him from breaking down again. His fist clenched just a little tighter. "Who the hell are you and who the hell is this?" Ace growled at Monkey, who up until then had been staring at his counterpart like he was some sort of alien. The Marine took a moment before he answered, "I'm Monkey D. Luffy." Ace looked shocked for a moment. Garp's grandson. "So who's this then?" Monkey grimaced. "He's me from an alternate dimension." "It's a long story." "Nanny, alternate dimension." Ace's jaw hit the ground before he stared in awe at the still crying man on the floor beside him. After a few moments of gobsmacked surprise, he reined himself in and shot a distrusting glare at the Marine. "So why are you here then?" It was Luffy who answered. The boy chuckled with a wet hiccup, drying the last of the tears. "They want me to fight Blackbeard. We didn't expect to see you." "And why are you crying?" Luffy gave a sad, nostalgic smile that seemed out of place on such a usually cheerful person. "It's been years since I saw you last. Since you died." Anything up to that point was pebbles compared to the boulder that crashed down on Ace then. He couldn't doubt that it was the truth. The Whitebeard pirates were aware that the Marines had been investigating possibilities of alternate dimensions and how to create a bridge between them. Apparently it had worked. But now, so let me get this straight. In another world, I somehow know Luffy, probably pretty well, and somehow, in this other world, I'm dead. What the fuck is that supposed to mean? He said out loud. However, Luffy only started to cry again, and Ace decided that yelling wasn't going to be the best way to get information out of the pair. With a heavy sigh, he got to his feet and rummaged around the small kitchen before making some nearly instant tea with some water and his fire-related abilities. Monkey helped his double to his feet and set him down at the table next to him. Ace sat opposite to them, right next to the door if he needed a quick escape route. Both of them watched as Luffy drank his tea, using it to calm his frayed nerves and settle the jitters that had been shooting through his body. But it was really, really hard to relax when the man he considered his brother, the one that had died right in front of him to protect him, was currently staring at him like he was a complete fruitcake. Are you really going to be all right? Monkey asked him when he finished, to which he nodded stiffly at. Great. Now explain to me how you know me and why I'm dead in another world. Luffy jolted. He was still not ready to revisit those memories. He shook his head, gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles turned white. Ace let that one pass, scowling. How do you know a pirate in the first place? Monkey asked with obvious suspicion. Luffy, being in the delicate state that he was in, was very prone to letting things slip. I am a pirate, Luffy said as he royally screwed up the entire situation. The two witnesses in the room blinked once, in unison, before letting out a loud, synchronized, what? In the street, people stopped in their tracks, looking over shoulders and between houses momentarily. Coulson, along with his associate Andrews, stopped dead in their tracks before sharing a glance. Was that? Nah, couldn't have been. They both shrugged and continued on their way. Oops, I wasn't supposed to say that. Luffy grimaced before chuckling nervously at the incredulous stares he was getting from the other two. Garp dropped you off at Danton's, Ace deadpanned. Luffy nodded. Their reactions to his major revelation managed to ground him in reality, so he found he was ready to talk now. You didn't like me very much for a while. I thought you and Sabo were going to kill me. Ace laughed, leaning back in the chair and crossing his arms behind his head. What happened? Luffy quickly explained his discovery of their pirate savings and how they eventually became brothers. Ace chortled, eyes sparkling and quite amused at the turnout in the other world. He hadn't really considered getting to know Garp's legitimate grandson, even if they were technically family by adoption. In that other world, though, it sounded like he had, and that he enjoyed it quite a bit. Ace knew himself well. He was probably a better person over there. Luffy described the many adventures they had when they were young, from hunting wild animals to their daily sparring matches to annoying Danton to death. The two pirates were smiling with evident fondness, Luffy in memory while Ace in imagination. So how did I die? Ace inquired, now curious. Luffy's grin faded, and his eyes gave off a serious edge. Akainu punched a hole through your chest. A hole through my chest. Why'd I let that happen? Luffy lowered his head so that his straw hat was hiding his eyes. You saved my life. A deathly still silence permeated the small abandoned house. Ace could only think one thing. Oh shit, not again. When Luffy started to cry once more, Ace panicked, standing up abruptly and awkwardly gesturing for him to somehow stop. Hey, don't cry, I'm sure I had a good reason. Luffy looked up at his not brother before choking out. You were finally free though. I did all that stuff you save you and you had to go and protect me again. Free? What did you do for me? Ace whispered. Luffy stifled a sob before roughly explaining his break into Impel Down in the following war. Ace was suddenly humbled by the man. Luffy loved him so much that he would do some pretty crazy shit to make sure that he was safe, and then Ace went and died on the poor kid. If he were to meet his other self in the afterlife, he noted to punch him in the face, especially when Luffy started explaining in great detail exactly what had happened when he was free. I'm an idiot. Just another thing to add to my ever-growing pile of regrets. Ace was bitter. Luffy recollected himself before asking what had been itching at his consciousness the entire time. Why are you here? I'm hunting Blackbeard too, he sighed. Still, that fucker killed Thatch and handed Sabo over to the Marines. I'll kill him if it's the last thing I do. Sabo's alive in this world, Luffy said with wide eyes. You mean he's dead in your world? No, but I thought he died when we were kids. Ouch, we got to get him out. Luffy smiled, already excited to meet a pirate version of his other elder brother. Beads of sweat started to form on Ace's face as he realized the implications. You want to break into Impel Down a second time? Are you nuts? It'll be okay. I'm strong. You're also stupid. Come with me. Ace's mouth closed abruptly. The thought had occurred to him, but he also knew that it was practically suicide. What do you mean strong? Monkey spoke the first time and since Luffy let slip that he was a pirate, he's the strongest man in the world. That's why we brought him over, to help us win the war. You brought a pirate to help the Marines. Shut up, we didn't know. Luffy laughed as they fought. It reminded him of his and Ace's fights when they were growing up. So exactly how strong? Ace finally decided to ignore Monkey completely. Stronger than anyone, Luffy beamed. Let's make a deal then. I'll help you with your batshit crazy rescue plan to get Sabo out of Impel Down if you help me kill Blackbeard. Besides, we're both working towards the same goals in the first place. Sure. Oh, one more thing. He can't say anything, Ace hissed, pointing at Monkey. He won't, I promise, Luffy said confidently, shooting a look at Monkey while he elbowed him in the ribs. Monkey, who was still recovering from the fractures he received in their fight, struggled to breathe for a few moments. He didn't miss the hidden threat in Luffy's stare. It basically said you say anything and you're dead. The Marine swallowed harshly, not daring to say anything back. Great, let's go then, Ace said enthusiastically, standing up and brushing off his pants. Blackbeard's on the island. Monkey felt sick to his stomach. He's a pirate. In that other world, where he was the strongest man in the world, he was a fucking pirate. The revelation had him reeling, and he almost wanted to cry too. How he'd become an evil, backstabbing, disgusting murderer was beyond his imagination. He listened. He had to listen. He had to watch too. Everyone was in danger at this point. Something bad was going to happen. He knew it. Something really bad that would probably get a lot of people killed. He had to stop it. He would wait. Don't look now, but I think we may have company. Toma and Rika nearly jumped out of their skin as Vegapunk placed a bony hand on each of their shoulders, his voice dipping to a whisper. Toma nearly dropped some of the wires he had been holding, and he hissed in pain when a crack of electricity burned his fingers. What the hell? The man hissed, glaring at his superior over his shoulder. Admiral Akainu has decided to drop by for a visit, so I trust that you two will keep your mouths shut. I'm sure you know why he's here. The elderly scientist growled under his breath, eyes darting to the tall figure of the Marine on the other side of the room. Vegapunk's goggles were pushed up onto his forehead, something that he did when he was under stress. Toma's mouth pressed into a thin line before he nodded. Stick around after you're all done working, all right? I need to speak to you too. Vegapunk whispered before releasing his hawk-like grip on his subordinate's shoulders. Rika and Toma exchanged a glance as he stalked away, coat flapping behind him. He's in a bad mood, Toma noted seriously. Rika didn't reply, opting to sneak a glance in the Admiral's direction. He was sifting through the crowd, speaking to individual workers and scientists. When he looked up, his intense gaze settled directly on her. Sweat poured down her face as she whipped around and reorganized the pile of papers in front of her. What's wrong? He asked. Akainu, she squeaked out. Her heart felt heavy. She could practically feel the tension around the world mounting. Something was going to happen soon. However, they had more pressing concerns. The previously mentioned Admiral slowly and steadily made his way around the workshop before he approached the nervous pair. Both of their bodies were tight like a drawn bow, their anxiety nearly visible. Just like Vegapunk had done earlier, Akainu placed a hand on each of their shoulders as his own way of telling them that there was no escape. Under normal circumstances, the action just wouldn't be professional. But in this case, it was simply threatening. How's work going? Akainu's hoarse voice asked deceptively innocently. Rika tensed even more to the point that she was holding back tears. Just fine, sir, Toma said politely, his jaw clenching. I'm sure this whole experience has been mind-numbing, especially for the two of you who know that man so well. Not that well, sir. The one we pulled through is virtually a stranger, not like our Luffy, Rika said weakly, trying not to shake. The Admiral paused, evaluating her answer. He then sneered. I don't trust that kid, understand? You shouldn't either, so if you have any information, tell me, or I'll hold you both responsible if anything happens. Both of them shuddered. They both let out a breath they didn't know they'd been holding as the Admiral left the room. What the hell was that? Toma shouted, venting his anger. He paced back and forth, only fueling his agitated mood. Rika watched on sitting on top of a desk and fiddling with her lab coat. Vegapunk leaned against the nearby wall, just as bothered. That's a clear provocation, gotta admit. If Toma had anything close at hand, he would have thrown it. Fuck, Vegapunk, what's going on? Toma roared at his superior, stopping in his tracks to glare daggers. The scientist was silent for a moment. Admiral Akainu's first impression of Luffy, the other world's Luffy, was poor at best, and vice versa. There's a deep-seated hatred for Akainu in that man's heart, and Luffy being. Well, Luffy, he's not the best at rationalizing. He hates our Akainu just as much, maybe even more. I don't know why. And it seems as though Admiral Akainu has picked upon the subtler changes in your friend too. Since when does Luffy know the meaning of the word subtle? Toma shot back. Vegapunk gave a short bark of laughter. Under normal circumstances I would agree with you, but this is a bit more complicated. The two Luffy's lives are very different. I'll tell you what I told Sengoku. That man is dangerous. Dangerous, Toma snorted. He'd heard of what happened at Alabasta. And he'd seen the other Luffy do some pretty wild things in the short time he'd known him, but still, it was Luffy they were associating the word with, which was new to him. The man who played with children in the city streets, who'd only ever used his gun once and couldn't stand the sight of blood, was dangerous. Absolute madness, it was. And well known for it too, Rika whispered quietly under her breath, but evidently loud enough that the other two in the room hear her. What do you mean by that? Toma stared. On the other hand, Vegapunk's eyes widened in a moment of realization. Oh my, you already know, don't you? The scientist laughed, throwing his head back. Then consider me impressed. Rika flushed, not able to meet their gazes. She remembered the night spent talking on the rooftop, he telling her about the people he cared about and some of the things he'd gone through. What? Toma gawked, looking back between the two of them. Will someone explain to me what you're talking about? Toma, do you remember when Luffy told us that he wanted to be a pirate? Of course, why? She gave him a significant look, raising her eyebrows. Oh, Toma breathed, getting what she was trying to say. Yeah, so, now that we are on the same page, I'm sure that I won't have to remind you of what could happen if we let that little bit of information get out. The two of you are closest to the Luffy of this world, so I trust you with this knowledge, Vegapunk said seriously. Toma nodded, dumbstruck, completely calm now. So why is he, the other Luffy, helping us then? He wants to go home, obviously. However, the work that we are doing right now is completely irrelevant. What do you mean irrelevant? Rika scowled. This isn't his home. And he has family and friends over there, too. We have to find a way to get him back there. Vegapunk smiled in his annoying I know something you don't know way, a mischievous twinkle in his eyes. Exactly, and this is why I need your help. Things are getting restless. Ripples are spreading from the point when Luffy was brought into our world. And soon we are going to have to face the consequences of such a gamble. We cannot control Monkey D. Luffy. It is not in his nature, nor is it our place to do so. What we have to do is make sure that when this does end, it doesn't end in disaster. Toma and Rika steeled themselves and nodded. Good. In the meantime, I need your help with something. Rika's jaw dropped. I can't believe him. That lying jerk. Now she was absolutely furious. That was totally unacceptable. The entire time. From the get-go, Vegapunk had a working portal between worlds, one more efficient than what they'd been working with, and it wouldn't blow up when activated either. The jerk. Rika fumed silently, glaring at the scientist who was now grimacing sheepishly. She'd felt just awful when Luffy had described his nakama and expressed his wish to see them again. And here was Vegapunk with the way to accomplish this. It pissed her off to no ends. And the worst bit was that he expected them to keep quiet about it. That's just cruel, Toma spat, closing the doors to the warehouse behind them. It was the middle of the night and here they were with a working portal at their fingertips. I'm sorry, but I had no other choice. It was an extra incentive to get Luffy working with us, to lie to him. Why are you showing us this, Vegapunk? Well, his crew demanded a price, so we'll just be loading boxes, don't worry. Rika felt the urge to punch something, but at the same time she felt a little excited. She'd heard stories of his crew, and she really wanted to meet them. Oh, and one more thing. Don't mention to his crewmates that he doesn't know about the existence of the portal. It could cause problems. You're an asshole. The first thing that Rika noticed about the Mugiwara crew was that they weren't what she imagined them to be, but at the same time they fit Luffy's descriptions to a T. There were only a few of them present to help carry the boxes to their ship, but Rika could pick out which one was which surprisingly easily. The swordsman Zoro, the doctor Chopper, the shipwright Frankie, the cook Sanji, and the sharpshooter Usopp were all present. They were all so unique that it was hard to mistake them for someone else. As soon as Rika walked through the liquid-like portal carrying a couple of boxes of various supplies, her burden was lifted by the blonde cook in a form-fitting black suit. He smiled down at her, because she was 2 heads shorter than him, and said, "Young ladies such as yourself shouldn't have to carry heavy things. Let me do that for you." She felt her heart flutter in her chest and a blush creep across her face despite herself, and it was hella embarrassing. If anyone else were to witness that, she'd never live it down. So she stood there, looking a little stupid, not really doing anything because the pirate cook had mercilessly flirted with her. "Pull yourself together," Toma said to her on his way past, his expression a little smug. Shut up," she blurted in embarrassment. On her way out the second time she nearly bumped into a huge towering figure, who glared at her as he swept past her. She felt her spine go cold, knowing that this guy could rip her in half without even moving. Her only comfort was that he had an embarrassing sense of direction, or at least from what she'd heard. As the cook was busy loading boxes, still she silently and meekly trekked down the forest path towards the shore of the island, where a colorful pirate ship was docked. It was magnificent, just like it had been described. She was in absolute awe. It almost felt like a dream, and she felt out of place. Is this what Luffy feels like? She wondered, pondering what exactly was going on behind the scenes in the pirate version of her best friend. She hated Vegapunk for lying. When she walked up the gangplank onto the grassy deck of the Thousand Sunny, she was surprised by how comfortable it felt. It was ridiculous. She was on a pirate ship, for God's sake, and yet it was just so welcoming that she was blown away. Once again she was reminded of the tension between the two Luffys, and her stomach felt like lead. "That was our first impression too," a voice said, making jump. She looked over to see an orange-haired woman smiling at her, who she assumed was the navigator Nami. Rika hadn't expected her to be dressed so revealingly, especially since Luffy obviously held her in high regards. First impression, Rika blinked, before realizing the navigator was talking about the ship itself. "Yeah, this ship is just amazing. Not something I'd associate with pirates." She chuckled. "Well, we're not really your conventional pirates, as you've probably noticed by now." Rika put down her boxes on the deck, as she was unsure where they wanted them. The others were steadily hauling in boxes, and the cook immediately picked up her share while saying something along the lines of, "I'll bring you a drink." "Yeah, I noticed," Rika said meekly. "So you're a Marine?" Nami eyed her, to which Rika grimaced too. "Technically I'm a doctor," she replied. The orange woman seemed to relax and gave her a warm grin. You should talk to Chopper before you go then. Thanks, I will. Rika tried to figure out how she was going to word the multitude of questions she had. Instead, Nami asked a question of her own, which Rika was grateful for. The silence was a little awkward, as they were so different. What's Luffy like in your world? She blurted out. Rika laughed, grinning fondly. A lot like yours, but there's some pretty obvious differences. Like what? Rika began to describe their Luffy, and some of the things that he'd done, and by the time she'd finished, most of the Mugiwara crew were crowded around and listening intently. They laughed when she told them some embarrassing stories of Luffy or what Luffy had done to other people. The poor boy was clueless. Some of the crew admitted that they'd had similar frustrations with his stupidity or his stubbornness, and other times they were surprised by what sounded like something Pirate Luffy wouldn't do. They told stories to pass the time, and Rika could only admire the pirate captain. So how's he doing right now? Usopp asked. She liked him. He was nice, sensible, and down to earth, even if it sounded like he exaggerated things just a little. I'm not sure. He went off with our Luffy and Vice Admiral Garp to hunt Blackbeard. As soon as she mentioned the Yonku's name, there was a collective hiss of hatred and disgust. Did I say something wrong? No, it's just that Blackbeard is one of the most disgusting people we've ever met. And we've met a lot of psychopaths. He's one of the few people our captain will never, ever forgive, under any circumstances. The Blackbeard in your world is going to be in for one hell of a beating, Nami explained. The thought made her a little uncomfortable. Yeah, as long as Akainu doesn't show up, everything should end just fine. Usopp noted casually. Rika went pale, and her eyes went wide. The Mugiwara crew was perceptive and picked up on this. The cook tried to make a big deal out of it, but was ignored. Akainu is an admiral at headquarters, she said quietly, and all the pirates reeled back in shock. Where's that portal? I want to go cut him up, Zoro growled, resting one of his hands on the hilt of one of his swords. Rika flailed her arms in panic. No, you can't. Akainu already suspects that there's something going on. You'll just make it worse. Besides, what did he ever do to you? A grim silence fell on the assembled group before Nami spoke up. It's not what he did to us, per se, but what he did to Luffy, and because of what he did, we can never forgive him. When we found him, we showed him no mercy, but we still carry that hatred, Sanji said. Rika gaped at them. What do you mean? Have you seen the scar on Luffy's chest? The historian, Nico Robin, asked her. She nodded. Akainu gave that to Luffy after he murdered his brother in front of him during the war at Marineford 7 years ago. Oh, the revelation hit Rika like a ton of bricks, and she could only stare, horrified at the thought. She wanted to cry, and when she did, Nami rubbed her back. Oh my god, I didn't know, she whispered between sobs. The way that he avoided looking at the bay the first day he arrived was because he looked so sad, watching the ocean. What are you thinking about? My brother. And then she discovered that their problems had just gotten a lot worse. What's going to happen to us? Miles and miles and miles away, in a different world entirely, Marines and a single pirate were sleeping peacefully. The two of the same person had yet to journey inland, had yet to meet the 2nd Division captain of the Whitebeard Pirates, and had yet to hunt Blackbeard. The sole individual who was awake watched as his counterpart slept, a frown tugging at his lips. What's going to happen to us? The thing that he did know was that whatever did happen, it was going to end in blood. They were smiling. The two pirates were smiling, still exchanging stories and laughing gleefully. They got along exceptionally well, which had an eerie edge to it, or at least to him it did. The world was deaf. It passed by them not noticing how wrong this was. What was worse was that it himself doing it. He was a pirate in another world. When he was little, he used to think that pirates were awesome, having adventures all the time and getting the treasure at the end. He thought of them as these free, strong people, and it awed him. He was also without a father to look up to. Garp had brought him to Marineford so that he could be a Marine. But when he was still a kid, he would argue with the sailors who always ruffled his hair and said things like, "You'll understand when you're older." Understand he did. They were filthy. They stole and murdered and lied and cheated. They were not to be trusted. Luffy was 10 years old when he had his first real encounter with a pirate. Oh, it was such a kick in the pants when he saw what they were really like. It was the very first time he was allowed to go on a mission with his grandfather, and even then it was a routine patrol. They had raided the ship. They were strong, too, strong for the Grand Line even. One particular man, one missing a lot of teeth and had a dog-based devil's fruit, spotted him from across the deck when everyone was distracted and fighting. It was a hunt to that bastard. He was playing with his food. Luffy remembered how scared he was, how absolutely terrified, and just before he lost consciousness his grandfather had finally found him, but the damage was done. Luffy had been bedridden for weeks. There was one particular scar on his right shoulder blade that never really healed either. Oh, the blood. There had been so much blood. The word pirate had been tainted for him ever since. And there was Mugiwara, a different version of him, who'd grown up to be one of those monsters. Monkey couldn't even begin to imagine the blood that was on his hands. It was himself, too, which horrified him the most. It wasn't right. The world could be very well ending and they wouldn't give a damn. All those people he'd seen, whose lives were ruined by selfish scum. He'd seen crying families clutching the mangled bodies of loved ones, children abused and abducted, people willing to die just to protect those they cared about. In the end, pirates became the face of evil, as it was for so many others, and he made a promise to himself that he'd protect innocent people from them. Mugiwara being a pirate, it was insulting, and only reinforced the uneasy feelings he'd been getting. Something bad, something really bad was going to happen, and Mugiwara was right in the center of it. I have to stop it. The pirate Luffy was completely oblivious to the Marine Luffy's turmoil. Nothing could dampen the Pirate King's spirits, it seemed. He got to meet his brother again, even if it wasn't really his brother and he was going to have to say goodbye to this one eventually too. But that was something he'd deal with another day. Today was a good day. He hadn't really noticed it, but when he thought of Ace he'd always had that overwhelming guilt stashed away. Sure, he'd talked about Ace with his Nakama and Rayleigh and others. He'd promised himself that he wouldn't let another person precious to him die. So far he'd kept it. But on those bad days, because yes, even Luffy had bad days, his thoughts would travel back to that incident. He wouldn't wear his cardigan just because of the color. Anything red would set him off. When night fell he'd stay awake, mourning his brother. It was an ache that never really dulled. It was an ache carved into his skin, literally. It was a relief to be able to talk to Ace again. Because hell, this was Ace, whether it was an alternate Ace or not. It was still Ace. His heart wouldn't stop thundering in his chest. And he felt a guilty pleasure in telling this Ace about what he'd been thinking and feeling when that shit went down. Now his thoughts turned to Blackbeard. A simmering hatred bubbled up from the pit of his stomach when thinking of that fucker. Their first meeting, well, second, after all that stuff in the bar with Bellamy had happened, Luffy had been almost impressed. He thought that he wasn't such a bad guy after all. It had been a real slap in the face when months later the man had appeared in Impel Down, claiming that he was Blackbeard, the man who had handed Ace over to the Marines. From what this Ace had said, Sabo wasn't in line for execution, which was good, but it still made Luffy uneasy because he'd been down there for a while. When Luffy had asked, Ace wouldn't answer and instead scowled. Oh well, what was important was that he was talking to Ace, his dead brother, and they were going to beat up Blackbeard together. It was like a dream come true. You're crying again? The other pirate said, to which Luffy blinked it before rubbing his face with the sleeve to his sweater. No, I'm not, I'm fine, he protested. Good, because we're nearly there, Ace said, his voice lowering to nearly a whisper. Luffy smiled and nodded before mimicking Ace's hand movements by placing a finger to his lips. He snickered, following his brother as he crouched down in the foliage. The other side of the island had sudden cliffs, with beautiful views of the ocean. As it was an autumn island, all the leaves on the trees were orange and red and yellow, which made for a blended painted-like imagery. It was breathtaking, but that wasn't concerning them right now. The old man in the village had said that his son was an inventor, but could repair anything. The three of them peeked out from the bushes and saw the said inventor kneeling on the ground in chains. Ace looked over at their ship and noted that it was in disrepair. They must need him for repairs more than anything else. Probably hit some rocks in shallow water. Their navigator is an idiot. Hey, I recognize them. Aren't they supposed to be in Impel Down too? Luffy said, frowning as he looked at the assembled pirates. Yeah, there was a breakout after Blackbeard became a Shichibukai. Events concerning him were pretty similar to your story, minus me and Whitebeard dying, or that whole war in general. We have to be really careful though, because, before he got the chance to finish, Mugiwara had jumped from the bushes and walked casually towards the group of bloodthirsty pirates. Baka, Ace shouted, terrified for the poor kid. He still wasn't fully convinced of his apparent strength just because of how the kid was crying all over him and his obvious admiration for the man who'd become his brother. Sure, he measured to be stronger than Whitebeard, but from his story that wouldn't be enough to save him. And he was so skinny. He leaped after the straw hat-wearing boy, intent on saving his ass before he was squashed, while Monkey sat in the bushes, absolutely dumbstruck. Blackbeard turned to the two of them, his mocking grin growing. Fire Fist, I didn't expect to see you here. How have you been? Shut up, Ace roared, his blood boiling. And who's your friend here? The Yonko asked, fixing his gaze on the younger man. I'm Monkey D. Luffy, and I'm going to kick your ass. Again, he said, his own grin widening. Surprised silence. Luffy kept a straight face, staring at Blackbeard. Teach sneered at the pair. Take care of them, he said, turning his back to them. Luffy's grin faded before he sent a wave of haki through the clearing. Blackbeard's subordinates shook dramatically before falling over, one by one, completely unconscious. Holy shit, was Ace and Monkey's thoughts. Blackbeard stopped dead in his tracks before looking over his shoulder at the man who'd just decimated his forces without moving a muscle. His grin was gone and he scowled at the man's smirk. There was a glint in the eyes of the black-haired kid. Something different. There was a silence in the forest as everything held its breath. The tension was nearly unbearable. And then, suddenly, without warning, they pounced. Luffy leaped into the air and sent a bone-crunching punch into Blackbeard's jaw. whose head snapped to the side as he spat out blood and a handful of teeth. The Yonko stumbled backwards, clutching his mouth and crying out in pain. Gear second. Luffy left no time for the Yonko to recover and sent him every which way across the clearing. Even the air shook with the power in those punches, and it was a testament to Blackbeard's, and through that, Luffy's power that Teach could handle more than one. Ace and Monkey watched in awe, their jaws hanging open as they watched Luffy kick Blackbeard around with hardly any effort. He was a pink and black blur, and at some points they couldn't even see him. They winced at every blow delivered, because they knew that it would hurt like a bitch, and they could easily kill a normal person. Neither had any trouble imagining him as the strongest person in the world now. Of course, to give credit to Teach, the Yonko was able to pull himself together for long enough to activate his ability, and managed to send his own punch, which missed narrowly. Luffy jumped back to stand a little ways away, watching and grinning menacingly, a flicker of hatred in his black eyes. Black hole. Blackbeard thought he'd won at that moment. I don't know who the hell you are, kid, but I don't care. No matter how good you are, you're still a devil fruit user, and you can't beat me. Baka, weren't you paying attention? I said that I was going to beat you again, he smirked. Luffy then did something completely unexpected. His body, or the parts that they could see, began to turn a shiny black. Hacky was the unison thought between the three other conscious people, and a hard dread filled their stomachs. The pirate then brought his thumb to his mouth, which looked rather out of place in the middle of a fight, but when he bit down on it, making a little rubber squeak, they knew something was coming. Luffy blew into his thumb, and his hand began to inflate until it was absolutely massive. Jet-armored elephant gun. He shouted before the massive fist collided with a stunned Teach lightning fast. There was a large explosion in the distance, and everyone in town looked towards the forest on the other side of the island. A cloud of dust and debris flew up into the air, accompanied by all the birds in the forest. Coulson and Andrews exchanged glances. That was definitely him. Yep. They took off running. Ace closed his jaw, shielding his face as they were pelted with clumps of dirt. There was now a good-sized crater in the middle of the damn forest with a squashed Blackbeard at the bottom. They weren't even really sure if he was alive anymore. And after that, he was supposed to feel pain just as much, or even more than normal people with his fruit abilities, right? The dust slowly cleared to reveal Mugiwara standing on the edge of the crater looking down into it. He'd returned to normal, so his skin wasn't pink and steaming or black and shiny, and his arms were normal-sized. His two spectators slowly and carefully approached the massive hole before looking down at a bloody and bruised Teach. Is he dead? Ace asked. I dunno, but I think I may have hit him too hard. Oops, the pirate laughed, scratching the back of his neck like he hadn't just killed a man. The other two glared at him. The others will be on their way after that, Monkey noted, glancing towards the town apprehensively. Damn, you're right. It would be bad if the Marines saw me here, Ace growled. Do you have to go? Luffy asked, looking sullen. Ace frowned before sighing. I'll find a way to contact you again, all right. We're still going to Impel down. Promise, Luffy said, panicking a little on the inside. Promise, Ace replied. Luffy launched himself at his brother's counterpart and enveloped him in a suffocating hug. The 2nd Division commander grimaced before patting the man on the back. He wouldn't lie and say that the mood swings were a little off-putting, but he sympathized and understood why. Ace peeled the man-child off of him before heading off towards the cliff face. Oh, and one more thing, he said, looking back at the nearly identical pair. What? Luffy blinked at him. Thank you, and see you later, he said before giving a little two-fingered salute and falling over the cliff backwards. Luffy waved goodbye, smiling bittersweetly. Whoa, Coulson breathed, taking in the ridiculous scene in front of him. Both of the Luffys looked at him with large, unblinking owl-like eyes, standing in the middle of what looked like a war zone. There was a crater, a freaking hole in the ground easily the size of a warship, with a mangled Teach lying at the bottom. His crew were scattered around the clearing, unconscious and foaming at the mouth, along with a man in chains which he assumed was a hostage of some sort. Good job, he croaked meekly, unable to come up with anything better than that in his shock. Garp woke suddenly and abruptly. He swatted away his grandson before sitting up in bed, his brow drawn together in confusion. It had been years since Luffy woke him up in the middle of the night. It must be serious then. What do you want? His voice was like gravel right after waking up. He flicked on a lamp and watched as Luffy pulled up a chair next to his bed. He didn't look like a troubled boy. No, he looked a lot older than he really was at that moment, and Garp felt his insides grow cold. Luffy, Jai-chan, Luffy began, his hands gripping his knees tightly. His teeth worked themselves side to side, and whatever was troubling him must be world-changing. The Vice Admiral frowned. He's a pirate, he suddenly shouted, making Garp jump. His grandson looked at him with intense eyes, both angry and confused and torn. It was pulling at him, wearing him down to the bone. He'd noticed Luffy was starting to withdraw, even if just a little bit. He was spending way too much time in his own head than was healthy for him. There was a growing resentment. Garp looked at the ground before answering, I know. Luffy felt betrayed. His grandfather had known. What the hell? Why? I don't know much, but that hat he carries around. It used to belong to Gul D. Roger, the Pirate King. Right now in this world it belongs to Akagami Shanks. I wanted to make Shanks proud too. Luffy remembered that dream, and the emotions from it that he pushed aside were recalled in a sudden wave. Mugiwara was ready to kill, and ready to die. It was fitting. Something big is going to happen. Jai-chan, I just know it, he whispered, holding back the tears of simply being overwhelmed. They were going above and beyond anything they'd ever encountered before, and nothing would be the same ever again. There was no pretending now. It was changed permanently. Yes, Garp agreed. If you get in the way of my dream, I'll kill you. He had to move faster. She was going to die if they didn't move. Blast of energy so thick that it burned the insides of his lungs. Zombies clinging to his limbs, rotting flesh writhing with maggots. She was crying, I want to live. The ocean was heavy, he was drowning. Blood, so much blood it's on my hands, he can't be dead. No, I will stop you, die you fucker. They buried him alive, dirt pattered on the coffin lid. She smiled, but they were all unconscious. They're dead. No, they're not. They're my Nakama. I'm not ready for this, I quote. I'm weak. The dog's eyes were brown and dark. I'm going to die. He's going to kill me. Come out and play, runt. Fingers crawled down his throat. He gagged and cried. But when he bit them, the man punched him in the back. The cook was dead. She'd tried to protect him. He danced with her mangled body, ribcage ripped open. His skin was ribbons, stinking blood pooling around him. The dog splashed the walls with it, painting pictures. Please stop. Somebody help me. Two simultaneously opened their eyes, hoarding air like it was in short supply. The Pirate King nearly fell out of the hammock, sweat clinging to his skin like a bad cold. He didn't often have nightmares like that, and they were only ever memories. That last bit had been different. It went from flashes of past experiences to a too real replay of a little kid being tortured and humiliated by a man with a dog's devil fruit. That was just sick, he scowled. He remembered when he was a kid and the local pirates had used the spiked gloves on him, and as painful as that experience was, in the dream the child he'd been was absolutely terrified, to the point that it almost made his nauseous thinking about it. Pushing it off to the side, he decided to ignore that mystery dream and instead go back to sleep. He breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth before rolling over. It was too early to think. On the other side of the bunk room of the warship, the Marine Luffy wasn't in a good state. Unlike the Pirate King, he wasn't used to dealing with nightmares. What the hell was that, he thought, stomach churning. He suspected that it was the same as the nightmares from months previous, the ones where he'd witnessed the pirate murder a person. But it changed, and it shook him up more than seeing flashes of Mugiwara's life, because that was his memory. Luffy could still remember what that man smelled like. He grit his teeth and looked over past several bunks to the hammock Mugiwara insisted upon. The other man shifted in his sleep, but never made a noise. I hope he isn't dreaming my dreams in return. Blackbeard was sent straight to the depths of Impel Down. Technically that was his second visit, and the warden had quite the fit when he realized that the man who'd trashed the place would now be their prisoner. A happy fit. He threw the Yonku down into the pits of level 6 with relish. They gave him maximum security containment due to his abilities and strength so that he would never see the light of day again. His crew was in a similar situation. The little girl had her father returned to her, and Luffy had been more than surprised to be thanked by the grandfather, a former pirate. The older man had just about sobbed all over him, while Mugiwara had laughed from the side. They returned to Marineford shortly afterwards. The whole trip had been one great mindfuck. Luffy was completely exhausted and had been dreaming more and more often to the point that during the day he was noticeably tired. So when he came back to the place that had been his home for nearly 18 years, he felt relieved. At least there was still some normality in this bizarre situation. He was unpacking when Toma approached him. The scientist didn't look so good, but his presence immediately brightened his day. After several weeks in close proximity to Mugiwara, he was nearly hysterical. Toma, how are you? He greeted with a cheesy grin. The brunette didn't look as thrilled to see him. Hello, Luffy. I heard that you two found Blackbeard. Luffy's grin faltered for a second. Ah, we did. They weren't kidding when they said he was scarily strong. Which one, the other Luffy or Blackbeard? Both. They fell back into silence, and Luffy continued to stare at Toma. The taller man looked distinctly uncomfortable under his gaze. Luffy, have you been sleeping at all? He finally asked. Luffy blinked at him in surprise. Not really. How did you know? I've known you for years. You're pretty easy to read after a while. He pouted and sat down on the edge of the bed. Toma cracked a grin. So what's been troubling you? I don't trust him, Luffy growled. He's up to something. Toma muttered under his breath, like bleed the Marines of our remaining money. Luffy almost missed it. What? Nothing. Continue. Toma waved his hand and leaned against the doorframe. Luffy let out a sigh and flopped back on the bed. Man, he'd missed it. It was really comfortable. Sure, the warships were cool, but this was his bed. A wave of exhaustion overtook him. He remembered the memory dream. You mean the dream that had you a wreck for 3 days? He gave an affirmative grunt. I think I've been having more of them. Toma raised his eyebrows. What kind of things did you see? The scientist had freaked over Luffy's weird mind-reading abilities for a little while after the two of them had met face to face. That's him, Toma, but had since gotten over it. For the moment it could help them get through the oncoming storm. A ruthless killer, Luffy replied solemnly. I saw him murder. He dropped off in mid-sentence, his gut churning. Toma walked over and sat down next to Luffy on the bed. Luffy looked up at one of his two best friends, feeling helpless. He'd seen his double befriend one of Whitebeard's commanders and beat the shit out of Blackbeard. Then he heard of some of his exploits from years previous and was just about directly threatened. That was just the tip of the iceberg, it seemed. They were the same age, and a lot can happen in a single year. Their lives were at the opposite sides of the spectrum. Now the pirate was going to stir up more trouble, on purpose, and his instincts were screaming at him to do something. Anything, to stop him from hurting anyone, but he felt absolutely helpless. It was something he loathed. He swallowed harshly and stared directly into Toma's eyes. Who did you see him kill? Toma asked urgently. Admiral Sakazuki Akainu. Ah, Garp-san, there you are. Garp had been brooding. He was normally a man of such action that brooding was something he did only when severely troubled. Normally his solution to just about anything was to charge in, kick ass and put the offenders in chains, or at least crush them so they couldn't run away. The root of his current problem was his grandson, and as much as he threatened to kill Luffy when he did something stupid, he would never actually wish substantial harm on him. But this guy wasn't exactly his grandson. And in a fight, Garp grudgingly admitted to himself that he would probably lose. Such was his misfortune. Don't even get him started on that bloody straw hat. Alternate universes were certainly a pain in the ass, he eventually decided. Only then was he interrupted. The elderly Marine turned his head and was shocked to the bone to see none other than Admiral Akainu standing next to him. His brow crinkled. Akainu hadn't been wandering headquarters of late, instead lurking behind closed doors, discussing matters extensively with his peers, or out doing field work. Just because they had the strongest man in the world didn't mean that the war was automatically won. A weapon is usually used more than once, after all. Also, he'd noticed the way that Luffy's friends got all panicky when the Admiral was nearby or mentioned. Vegapunk had taken to outright avoiding him. Do you have a minute to talk? The Admiral in question asked politely. Garp knew him to be a manipulative and unbending man. The fact that he was seeking him out was unsettling. He'd play the game though. I do. I was just admiring the view, he replied patiently, turning his gaze back to the window he'd been standing at, but watching out of the corner of his eye. Did you witness our guest defeat Marshal D. Teach? Garp's mouth pressed into a thin line. I'm afraid not. Only my grandson, Luffy, did. The results are in the report though, if you wanted to know. I was curious about your opinion, Akainu noted with a hint of aggression in his voice. Garp studied his face closely. To his alarm he noticed faded, hardly visible bruising on his neck. That boy is hiding things from us, and he is prone to violence. A sword can prove dangerous to its master when gripped by the blade. I'm getting sick and tired of all the metaphors, Garp scowled. He addressed the Admiral directly. Admiral Akainu, I respect you as a fellow soldier, but you must understand something about me. The man gave him a raised eyebrow. And what would that be? Garp got right in his face, angry enough that even the man of absolute justice took a step back. I don't care what he's like or what he's done. And I especially don't care about alternate versions or whatever. Luffy is my grandson, and I won't let you lay a finger on him. Luffy enjoyed his morning runs. He usually got up at the crack of dawn, ate, and then ran down to the docks. Today was no exception. The downside of being away on missions meant that he couldn't participate in his morning rituals. It was just about dead silent at this time of the day, when no one was up and the sun was just peeking over the horizon. The water was washed orange and pink, like the ocean was set ablaze. It filled him with feelings of contentment and peace. When it was warm, he spent time in the water, diving to the bottom of the bay trying to catch fish with his bare hands. He'd been heading down one of the last streets on his normal route when he was approached. There was a figure leaning against one of the buildings, seemingly waiting for him to arrive. As he approached, he sensed a flare from the cloaked figure, his sensing abilities triggering all alarms. Luffy stopped in the middle of the road, watching. The figure seemed to spot him, and the grin on their face was almost smug. They pushed themselves off the wall before approaching him. Monkey D. Luffy. Oh shit, he thought, recognizing the voice. Of course he would have a cloak. Porgus D. Ace was a wanted man after all, and walking into Marine headquarters was a stupid idea even by his standards. Luffy's body tensed and he prepared to fight if necessary. Why the hell are you here? He hissed. Ace smirked in response. Hey, no need to be hostile. I'm just here for the other Luffy. You wouldn't mind telling him to meet me down at the docks at midnight, would you? So he thinks that just because I'm in on their secret, that I'll help? Luffy scowled. Fire Fist chuckled at his sour expression. Thanks. He then strode off, disappearing into one of the alleyways. Luffy continued to glower at his back, enraged at his careless tone. I am a Marine captain. I don't help pirates. I'm worried, Garp said bluntly. Sengoku stared unblinkingly at him for a few moments before letting out a sigh. You are not the only one, he admitted. Garp took that as a sign that he wasn't going to be kicked out of his friend's office, so he pulled up a chair and grabbed the sake bottle that Sengoku had been sipping out. Boy, don't drink all of it, the Fleet Admiral said, exasperated. It seems like we tend to end up talking like this far too often. Garp mused, two old men worried that the world will end up in the toilet. All we can do is sit back and watch this damn thing unfold. It's frustrating. Sengoku nodded, letting the Vice Admiral piss out his worries. He reclined in his chair, taking off his seagull hat. I understand, he said soothingly. Garp drank more. I think I might end up drinking all your sake at this rate, he growled. Damn it all to hell. Garp, what's been ruffling your feathers? You've been moody since before you left to hunt Blackbeard. Sengoku was legitimately worried for his friend. It wasn't often Garp got so worked up about anything. Of course, the stem of all his problems usually seemed to be his grandson. He was the one thing Garp cared most for in the world, and the thing that annoyed him to no end. Sengoku knew this very well. He was also well aware that Garp was a stubborn mule and didn't like admitting anything was wrong. I haven't been moody, Garp argued like he was a hormonal teenager. I rest my case. Shut up. At least I don't have a flippin' seagull on my hat. There were a few moments of silence before they both broke out into laughter. Sengoku wiped a tear from his eye as he looked at his hideous hat. That thing is rather silly. You're telling me, Garp chuckled, downing a third of the bottle. Sengoku let the companionable silence continue, watching the sun shine on the water of the bay. There were kids playing down in the streets. Even in times of war, if kids could smile, there was hope. So what's really been on your mind? Who else? My grandson, the bloody buffoon, Garp grumbled under his breath. You know that straw hat that Mugiwara wears everywhere. It belonged to fucking Akagami Shanks and Roger before him. The Fleet Admiral let out a small chuckle. Honestly, that doesn't even surprise me. This is absurd. I had a chat with Vegapunk a few weeks ago, and he told me some things that really made me think. Garp snorted. That man has way too many secrets. Yes, he does. Did you know it was him that stole the light fixtures? Sengoku cracked a smile, which Garp matched. Anyway, he told me that the world he comes from is in an era of peace, which is likely accounted to Luffy, Mugiwara, as you're calling him, being the strongest man in his world. Here's the thing though, Vegapunk said that Mugiwara is no hero and that he's ruined just as many lives as he's saved. Garp grimaced, so I was right. He's a pirate. I think so too. It would certainly explain why he laughed so hard when we asked for his help in the first place. The two old men guffawed at the thought and how ironic that was. Don't you think that the fact he has Roger's old head strike you as symbolic? What do you mean? He raised an eyebrow. Well, Vegapunk happened to mention Roger in our conversation. I think he might have been trying to tell me something. Something seemed to dawn on the Vice Admiral. Wait, you don't think he's... No way. Sengoku gave a shrug. We won't know unless we ask him, and I'd rather not risk him running for now. He's been willing to help us in the meantime. Garp set down the bottle of sake and collapsed in his chair. I'm getting old for this. Again, you're not the only one. The Gorosei are bitching up a storm and I'd rather not deal with them most days. They're not happy about the Mugiwara situation. He gave a sympathetic nod. Did you know that Sakazuki has something planned? He approached me to fish for details of his fighting capabilities. No doubt looking for obvious weaknesses. A flash of anger crossed his face. Sengoku didn't look surprised, but slightly perturbed. Yes, he did something similar after Crocodile was arrested. We held a meeting to formally ask Mugiwara for assistance, and Akainu was especially interested in why he'd knocked everyone unconscious. If I didn't know better, I'd say that Mugiwara was purposely hiding the extent of his abilities. Then again, Luffy's never been one to boast. He acts like a child half the time. Garp slid his hand down his face. Those two give me a headache. I think that after all of this is over I'm going to retire. Sengoku smiled fondly at his longtime friend. I've had similar thoughts. They were just two old men worried for the world. What happened while you two were gone? Rika asked borderline politely. She was very anxious to find out what had happened. Several weeks on a boat with your alternate self that you previously tried to kill. Not a good combination. Luffy stuffed 3 sandwiches in his mouth, staring at her. She had to admit that the staring was creepy. I hope he's just formulating an answer. He swallowed and she was slightly grossed out at the way his neck stretched, but didn't comment. He's been seeing my memories, the pirate said simply. Rika gawked at him. What? In his dreams? Luffy elaborated, looking at her like she was some sort of idiot. Why you're irritating in any incarnation. All right, she sighed. Let me rephrase that. How did you two catch Blackbeard? Luffy gave a half-hearted shrug. Ace told me where he was and then I beat him up. Ace, my brother, but the one from this world though. Rika tried not to be sick as she remembered what his crew told her. The front of his shirt was open and she tried not to stare at the large burn scar on his chest, courtesy of the other Akainu. Luffy continued to eat, unmindful of her disquiet. Monkey D. Luffy wasn't in the best of moods. It didn't help that as he was searching for Rika, he'd found her sitting with Mugiwara at lunch. That hadn't registered well. Oh no you don't. He growled to his mindscape and crossed the room in angry strides. Oh, hi Luffy, Rika greeted him as he came over. We were just talking about you. I'm sure you were, Luffy muttered before he grabbed her by the arm and started dragging her out of the room. Oi, Luffy, what the hell are you doing? She yelled, angry that he was being forceful. His grip was actually painful. He let her go only when they were outside of the mess hall and down a deserted hallway. Why were you talking to him? Luffy hissed. He looked agitated and restless, ready to bolt at any moment. There were dark circles under his eyes and his hair was messier than ever. In short, he looked like shit. This did not go unnoticed. Rika frowned in frustration at him. What makes you think that it's any of your business? I can talk to who I like, and he's practically you in the first place. No, he's not, Luffy roared, and Rika recoiled in shock. The last time he was this angry was when he'd first seen his counterpart, but that hadn't lasted long. He'd recognized that he was being unfair to his friends. But this time he seemed so frantic that he was almost beyond reasoning. Luffy, listen to yourself, Rika said calmly. You're being irrational. He's on our side. He gave a near hysterical bark of laughter. You really believe that? You said it yourself. He's scary when angry. He wouldn't hesitate to hurt people. He's still you, no matter how much you deny it, and he isn't that much of a jerk. Unlike you, you're being awfully jerky right now. She crossed her arms over her chest and stared at him like a mother lecturing their child. He's going to break into Impel down. Luffy suddenly yelled, along with Porcus Diaz. He's a pirate. Oh, Rika stared up at him in horror. How long have you known? She dreaded the thought of their Luffy finding out the truth of the other one. And now he had. He wasn't taking the news very well. She looked down at the floor, hiding her eyes with her fringe. Luffy was breathing heavily and his body trembled in half-restrained anger. When she didn't respond, she could almost hear his confusion. Rika, he said unsurely, voice vulnerable for a moment. She grit her teeth. Does it even matter? She said quietly, and his gaze burned. His breath hitched and the tension mounted again. You even told Toma and I that you wanted to be a pirate once. At least in one world you're able to live happily, right? The hell is that supposed to mean? Luffy growled. And he gripped her shoulders tightly. Rika tried not to flinch. Maybe you're right, he isn't you. But at least he isn't blinded by prejudice, she hissed. Luffy's eyes widened, and he stepped away from her, expression akin to a mix of betrayal and disgust. You knew, he said quietly. You knew he was a pirate. Rika couldn't look him in the eyes, but nodded her head stiffly. He began to back away from her. Luffy, I'm sorry for not telling you. I knew you'd be angry and I didn't want you to fight again, she said, water welling at the edges of her eyes. He looked hurt, and she knew she'd made a terrible mistake. His expression turned stony, and he turned his back to her. She started after him, but stopped when he spoke. See you, he said quietly, and began running. Luffy, she cried after him, Luffy. It was no use. He wasn't listening anymore. Luffy roared and punched the wall, fury thrumming through his system. You knew the entire time. He hadn't realized that he was crying. It hurt. She'd known all along that the monster with his face had been a pirate, murderer, and hadn't thought he would need to know. No, she'd purposely kept it from him, even lied to him. I thought you trusted me. Eventually he stopped, staring down at his bloody knuckles. They weren't going to be very happy with him because of all the repair bills. He'd lost count of how many times his grandfather had lost his cool when he'd broken a wall, it being an accident or on purpose beside the point. Then he heard voices. Curiously, he listened to them. He recognized them belonging to Admiral Akainu and Admiral Kizaru. His breathing evened out and the rage that he'd been feeling sunk back into his unconscious. It's going to be a problem if he has mastery over all three colors of Haki, Akainu said lowly. Kizaru answered after a moment of contemplation. He likely has a devil fruit, so throwing him into the ocean or Kairoski bullets should work. Luffy knew who they were talking about instantly. The two admirals were talking about his counterpart, so they must know too. An idea came to him. He stepped out into the hallway that they were walking down. The two admirals stopped in their tracks, staring at him in surprise. He looked up at them without fear, and then smiled. I have something to tell you, sir. The Pirate King was being followed. He thought that if the guy was going to tail him, they could at least put some effort into it. There wasn't even any challenge. Luffy could practically hear when the man took a step. Classy shoes were a little impractical if you were trying to be sneaky, as they made all kinds of clacking sounds, especially on cobblestone streets. He was a little disappointed in this regard. Maybe it was just because he was way too strong now and this version of the Marines weren't prepared for him. A grin broke out across his face and he chuckled as he traveled through the dark alleys. At least Kobe has some strong admirals back home, he mused. His friend had gone through many of them trying to find a specialized team that could give Luffy a challenge. The previous three had quit after only one encounter. I wonder why though, they were cool. The new guys were relatively inexperienced, but when they worked together they were quite formidable. He had a lot of fun fighting with those guys. Luffy turned a corner and came to a dead end. He blinked owlishly at the dark reddish bricks, pouting and scratched the back of his neck. He concluded that he'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. Whatever, he shrugged and crouched down, about to jump onto the roof of the building. He was supposed to meet Ace at the dock soon, but in his excitement he'd snuck out of headquarters early. This was the sort of stuff he thrived on, and being able to do it with his brother's counterpart made it that much better. It had been a very long time since they'd fought side by side. A flash of light nearly caught him off guard, but his natural reaction time proved useful and he launched himself up into the air. From above the buildings, he saw a ball of yellow-white light that made the ground shake and walls crumble. Is he really attacking people's houses? Luffy thought with surprise, landing on the shingles of a nearby house. He frowned at the Marine Admiral. Hey, what the hell are you doing? You could hurt people. Kizaru gave him a sideways look from the street below. He wasn't wearing his uniform coat and had one of his hands in his pockets. Oh, I didn't think you'd care. The man grinned, and Luffy tried not to gag at the smarmy tone. This guy was seriously creepy. Besides, we aren't in the residential area anymore, so there's no one here. He continued to stare down at the Admiral. What do you want? He asked, impatient. It was getting closer to midnight. Ace would be mad at him if he was late. I'm sure you've heard the justice speech numerous times, so I'll save you time by simply killing you. If anything, Kizaru's grin grew. Luffy tilted his head to the side so that his face was hidden in shadows. The moon was full and plump in the sky behind him, and an ocean breeze ruffled his clothes. I'd like to see you try, he replied, voice low and challenging. The Admiral's eyes widened from behind his orange sunglasses and his grin faltered for half a moment. The muscles in both of their bodies tensed in preparation. Kizaru disappeared in a shimmer and reappeared at the pirate's side, leg extended in attack. A smirk replaced Luffy's frown as he met the Marine's shin with his forearm. Luffy's arm was black with haki, and he distinctly saw a bead of sweat forming on the other's brow. Kizaru whipped around and tried to roundhouse kick his head, but the king ducked at the last possible moment and disappeared. A fist collided with Kizaru's spine, and he exploded in a ball of light. The shockwave sent the pirate flying up into the air, the sky tipping as his body flipped. He extended a hand and pushed himself off the peak of a rooftop, righting his balance and landing him on another structure. Luffy dug his heels into the tiles of the roof, watching as the sphere of light washed the nearby streets white. It was almost like daybreak had come early. He adjusted the straw hat on his head, brow creasing. Am I imagining it, or is he faster than I remember? A voice to his left spoke, You're good. He slowly turned around, fingers clenching and unclenching. Are we going to keep talking or are we going to fight? I kind of have somewhere I need to be. Kizaru leered at him, a sort of light forming between his hands. Yes, I know, you have an appointment with the morgue. Luffy crouched down in a battle-ready stance, his own grin growing. He was confident in the face of the Admiral, and it seemed that the other man wasn't happy about it. I have some time before I have to meet Ace anyway. This won't take long. We'll see about that, the king laughed. Ace tapped his foot against the ground, growing impatient. When the hell is that idiot going to show up? A tick mark appeared on his forehead as he scanned the nearby streets for signs of movement. It was times like these that he wished he'd trained more in haki instead of just getting down the basics and then running off after teach. In some ways, he was clearly at a disadvantage. He checked his watch for like the zillionth time before giving a huff of irritation and sitting down on one of stone ledges that lined the plaza. If he had to wait here all night, he was going to be beyond pissed. It didn't help that he was a wanted pirate that so happened to be sitting in the largest marine stronghold. If he was caught, it would be seen as a direct attack against the world government, and that would not end well. There was also the story of how his counterpart had been executed. He'd be lying if he said it didn't bother him. Just being anywhere near this place was giving him the creeps, knowing that in another world this was the place he died. Ace looked down at his chest, his leather jacket being unbuttoned out of habit, and sighed. There was no massive fist-sized hole there. Mugiwara had been completely devastated by the events, and even years later the pain was still fresh. Looking into those eyes, Ace was drawn into the story and could practically hear the screaming of soldiers and the feeling of a fist punching through his body. It hadn't happened in this world though. The old man was still alive, Ace was still alive, and he was stronger than ever before. There was no way in hell that Blackbeard was going to catch him off guard like that. This world's Ace was shrewd and could assess and take advantage of opportunities presented to him better than the other Ace. He wasn't so sure whether the reason he agreed to break into Impel down was tactical reasons or the fact that he genuinely liked the stupid kid. Maybe it was just the thought that revenge was in his reach. When I get my hands on Teach, he scowled, I'll tear him limb from limb. He couldn't even admit to himself that he was a coward for not going after Sabo when he was taken. This Mugiwara kid certainly had guts, storming Impel down twice. Who the hell in their right mind would do that? While being fond of Mugiwara, he was convinced that the other pirate was batshit crazy. and for good reason. It isn't every day that a cross-dimensional traveler starts crying all over you. He still wasn't sure how he felt about that one. The only upside of the situation was that Sabo wasn't about to be executed anytime soon, as he wasn't the son of one of the world's worst criminals. Still, Impel Down was considered hell on earth. Mugiwara also probably knew the layout of the prison and how to get around, having been there himself. He had himself a guide that was a complete idiot. And insane. Maybe his chances weren't that good after all. He was broken from his thoughts when a flash of light lit up the sky. A low drone spread through the air from the center of the blast, making waves in the bay behind him. His eyes widened as he made out two silhouettes fighting. Is that? You shouldn't have agreed to help him. Ace's eyes took on a murderous glint as he looked at the Marine standing in the entrance to a side street. His gaze was stony and sword already drawn. So this was a setup? He asked as he got to his feet and brushed off his pants. If they had to fight their way out, then it meant Impel Down would be waiting for them. This needed to end quickly. He also wasn't very keen on attracting the attention of anyone of higher rank than Vice Admiral, especially if it was Gar. The old Marine would beat the shit out of him. There was a slight grin on the other's face. I thought you would have expected that. Chuckling, he cracked his knuckles and stepped forwards. I can't say that it didn't cross my mind, so I'm going to have to fight the wind blade to leave this place. Or die. The Marine shrugged and tightened his grip on the hilt of the short katana. Your bones can rest on the seafloor. Ace examined the shorter man. Monkey D. Luffy's aura had practically done a 180, and instead of the boy that had been following him and Mugiwara around, he was giving off an imposing aura. He was wearing a proper uniform this time and his captain's coat. There was a gun strapped to his right leg. A malevolent grin split his face as his fingers tingled with sparks. This was going to be interesting. Or maybe I'll crack that thick skull of yours open, he growled. Luffy sneered at him before disappearing in a blur. He's really fucking fast. Ace jolted as his fist met the edge of the silver blade. Fire licked at his arms, but the haki in the edge of the sword was digging into his superheated skin. There were no traces of the innocent boy he'd met in the man's intense glare. The Marine shifted his stance and slashed towards his midsection. Before he could jump back, he felt it nick the skin of his stomach. The attack was immediately followed up by a second one, and Ace took several steps back. Shit, he's trying to push me into the water, he concluded as Luffy charged him. A burst of flame deterred the attack, and he hopped over the Marine's head to try and kick him in the back. His shin met the side of the silver sword, and it sent him flying backwards towards the buildings on the other side of the street. Ace lifted himself out of the rubble, coughing up brick dust and smoke. A smirk spread over his face as he adjusted his hat on his head. This guy was stronger than he looked. Sacred flame, see fire. He shouted and hurled twin lances at the Marine captain, who was watching him with narrowed eyes. A spear singed the edge of his coat as he leaped to the side, and the second cracked the ground behind his feet. Both of them sprinted at each other, sword in one's hands and balls of fire in the other's. As fast as Luffy was, Ace was easily able to match him. It would be a terrible fate to fall at the hands of a Marine captain by his standards. Nothing was going to slow him down. Not when he had bigger fish to fry. He danced out of the range of the sword and sent a flaming fist into the shorter man's stomach. Luffy landed on his feet a dozen feet or so away from Ace. He had his sword horizontal to the ground and both hands around the hilt, white-knuckled. His breathing was labored but eyes sharp, and his shirt was singed. Ace squared his shoulders and stared him down, expression blank. He tried not to wince as he realized the cut on his stomach was worse than he first thought. And now there was blood in his belly button heading for the waistband of his pants. Well, that's just swell. Ace tilted his head, showing his teeth as though to say, come on, is that all you got? He watched as Luffy's knee bent in preparation for attack, gritting his teeth. And he watched as a blur came out of nowhere and collided with the Marine's side. What the fuck? Ace thought in shock as he jumped back. The surprise had nearly given him a fucking heart attack. There was a loud splash as the swordsman hit the water. Luffy was seriously lucky that he could swim, or he'd probably be dead. His mouth dropped as he saw Mugiwara clinging to the edge of the wall, a stupid cheesy grin on his face. Ace, there you are. We have to go. The Marines are attacking. His hat was dangling off its string on his neck and his borrowed sweater was frayed on one side. But he otherwise looked fine. Ace fought off the urge to smack his palm to his face when the man laughed obnoxiously. Are you a fucking idiot? He screeched at him as the rubber man hauled himself up onto the street. There was brick dust covering his jeans, so he wiped it off before turning to the older pirate. Replacing his hat onto his head, the pirate beamed at him. Shishishi, come on, let's get out of here. Mugiwara grabbed him by the wrist and started to drag him off towards the docks. After about 10 feet of practically being dragged along the ground, Ace peeled the stretchy fingers from his arm and ran beside him. There was an exasperated sigh building in his chest, but he held it in. It wasn't like there was much he could do about the present situation at hand, and they needed to head out. If we can get out of here within the next few minutes, the gates will still be open. Ace grit his teeth as he ran. Mugiwara noticed that Ace was worried, but didn't comment. The Pirate King was in too good of a mood to worry, and Ace was such a warrior. This one especially needed to relax. "You're not leaving." A loud shout stopped them in their tracks. Ace and Mugiwara turned their heads back to the Marine, who was back on dry land. There was a pool of water surrounding him and his body was soaked to the bone. He honestly looked like a half-drowned cat. Also, he was pissed. Luffy raised his sword and slashed at the air fast enough to create a wave that barreled towards the two pirates at a speed they nearly couldn't follow. The two of them scattered as a chunk of the ground was sheared off and fell into the bay. Ace scowled at the Marine. The reckless rage he was emanating made him all the more dangerous. "That was just like Zoro," Mugiwara exclaimed in awe, eyes sparkling in wonder. "How did you learn to do that?" Ace saw Luffy's expression change. The Marine's body was tense, nearly shaking, though his hand was steady. His attention zeroed in on his counterpart, a man with the same face, and his expression held hatred that Ace didn't think Luffy was capable. The apparent disregard of the Marine's anger was likely insulting to him. Mugiwara obviously didn't see him as a threat. Luffy's form blurred as his use of Zoro kicked in. His blade moved in a flurry of slashes that his pirate counterpart dodged with ease. Mugiwara jumped up on top of the sword and used it as a platform to hurtle into the air and land behind the Marine. He swiped his legs out from under him, but Luffy used the momentum to cut at his neck, aiming to kill. This fight was not at all like their first one. Ace was frozen in place, watching as the two Luffys battled. It was like the pirate was toying with his double, with the way he was grinning and all. He was suddenly struck with a sense of familiarity, as though he'd seen this happen before. Maybe he had. He himself enjoyed fighting with the Marines. He was a pirate, and they were all adrenaline junkies. This was also the first time that Mugiwara really got to test out the other's abilities. And who wouldn't be excited by that? Eagle's ire. Luffy hissed as he twisted to the side, spinning in a circle and bringing his blade carving through the air. Mugiwara's eyes grew to the size of dinner plates as a building to his left was half. His legs automatically launched him into the air, shooting blood through his body. His skin took on a red glow and his limbs turned black as cuts continued to tear apart the ground. Heading straight towards him, there were sparks as the blade scratched at his flesh and shredded the sleeves of his shirt. Droplets of blood and water splashed his face, and he saw that the Marine was gripping his sword's hilt tight enough that his fingers were bleeding. The Pirate King slid across the ground when he landed, sandals scraping across the battered stone. The smile was gone, and now he was staring intently at his counterpart, who was breathing raggedly, sword still aimed towards him. Steam billowed around his form and his fists clenched. "Why are you fighting me? You're a pirate," Luffy spat at him. "And a monster." Mugiwara snorted at him in amusement. "You say that like it's a bad thing." Luffy let out a scream of rage and charged him, katana glinting in the moonlight. Mugiwara simply sidestepped him as the Marine charged past. He stopped himself from laughing aloud. That's when the pirate noticed that while they were fighting, the three of them had been surrounded by a group of Marines. All of them were preparing for battle, swords drawn and guns cocked. He frowned when he realized that he'd just made them his enemy. Again, and getting home would be quite the hassle. He wanted to see his nakama soon. Bang. First, there was nothing. Then a burning feeling seared his nerves and the muscles in his arm convulsed. Grunting in pain and the sudden loss in energy, he fell to one knee. A hand pressed against the left side of his chest in the space between his shoulder and ribs. He felt blood there. Kairoski bullets. Damn. Ace watched in shock as Luffy pointed his gun towards Mugiwara's head. A scream ripped from his throat. No. The Marine jerked in surprise as the pirate sprinted at him and crashed into his side, similar to how Mugiwara had earlier. The rest of the Marines charged them before a wall of fire flared up and around the trio. He didn't bother to listen to their exclamations of how Fire Fist had somehow infiltrated their stronghold. All he knew that he felt really fucking angry, and if they didn't get out of there right now, someone was going to die. A blast of his fury rippled through the air, and Ace didn't even notice as they toppled like dominoes. Mugiwara hissed as pain shot up and down his spine, and he clenched his teeth. His legs felt watery and couldn't support him any longer. The ocean's curse was really inconvenient sometimes. Ace grabbed him by the scruff of his shirt and hauled him over his shoulder as though he was a sack of potatoes. Luffy struggled to his own feet using his sword as a crutch. He was still steaming mad. "Where the hell do you think you're going?" he rumbled at the retreating pirate. That last blow knocked all the air out of his lungs and his vision was shaking. The 2nd Division commander paused and glanced over his shoulder. Luffy felt the air in his lungs burn. A wave of fear washed over him. Stay the fuck away from him. That was the last thing he remembered before he was engulfed in fire. "Fuck, this really hurts," Mugiwara whined. He was using the sleeves of his now ruined sweater to stifle the bleeding. The Kairoski bullet was launched deep in there. There was a trail of blood across the deck of the small boat, congregating where Mugiwara was now sitting on the stairs. Ace glared at him from where he was busy steering the boat. "Don't you know Kenbenshoku Haki? You should have been able to dodge that." Ace snapped back at him. "Seriously. He'd been dodging all of his counterparts' moves up till then, so what the hell had changed? Mugiwara pouted. I wasn't paying much attention to him. Besides, I didn't know he had a gun. It was strapped to his leg, you idiot. How the bloody hell did you not see that? Well, I don't use a gun. And he was wearing one of those coats, it looked weird on me. Ace gave a strangled sigh and smacked his head against the steering wheel. Oh god, he's hopeless. Why did I agree to help him in the first place? He's going to get the both of us killed. After knocking his skull against the wooden wheel several times, he heard the distinct vibrations of the gates of justice closing behind them. He'd slipped in with a ship 2 days earlier and had been counting on a scheduled delivery to get them out of there. It was a fucking miracle that they made it out. I wonder why the alarms didn't sound, he muttered. Mugiwara looked up at him and gave a one-armed shrug. The ones that attacked us weren't working on orders. Scrunching up his eyebrows, Ace contemplated this. So the Marines are divided. One side sees you as their salvation and the other wants you dead and gone. Back home all of the Marines want me dead and gone, except a few of them who are my friends, Mugiwara said as though it was a normal occurrence. He flashed the commander a toothy grin. You have Marine friends. Ace wasn't sure why anything about this man surprised him anymore. Well, Kobe's the fleet admiral and he lets me. Wait, you're friends with the fleet admiral? He blanched. Mugiwara snickered. Ah, you're a fucking lunatic. He only laughed harder. Rolling his eyes, Ace turned his gaze back to the horizon. By the time they reached the Impel down gates, Mugiwara's bleeding had mostly subsided. Ace helped him bind the wound with bandages he'd found somewhere on the stolen ship. And though the bullet was draining most of his strength, he'd regained the ability to walk. He had to admit, his endurance was impressive. Mugiwara had also torn off the sleeves to the shirt, as they were ruined anyway, and was busy trying to stretch his injured arm, despite Ace telling him to leave it alone. Fire Fist was scowling as they approached. They'd met no one at the Anai's lobby gates, and the ones before them were being guarded by a group of warships. On the plus side, the gates were still open, and if they could get past the blockade they were all set to go. He stood at the front of the boat, arms crossed over his chest, shifting his weight from side to side in anticipation. Oh, this was really getting on his nerves. How many of them are there? Mugiwara asked, stepping up beside him. He looked a little pale, but otherwise no different. He wasn't explicitly acknowledging that he'd been shot. A determined expression was on his face, and it made Ace feel calmer somehow. About 20, and armed to the teeth. There'll be maybe a couple hundred soldiers on each ship, and a lot of elites. I bet most of them have Kairoski. Ace narrowed his eyes as the warships started firing their cannons. A cannonball hit the water to their right and rocked the boat, threatening to push them off balance. Neither of the pirates flinched. I'll take care of it, Mugiwara said, voice steely. Ace looked over at him before smirking. If anything, he was looking forward to seeing what he could do. The strongest man in the world. Huh. The waves grew choppy as they sidled up in front of the Marine ships. He heard shouting from above and many of them already had their weapons drawn. He saw a couple harpoon guns that were outfitted with Kairoski tips. They looked rather painful. I'm not sure what would be worse, dying by being speared with one of those things or drowning. Mugiwara tipped his hat so that only one of his eyes was visible and most of his face was shadowed. Ace had to admit, the look was pretty damn intimidating. He was even starting to believe that this guy was the real deal. And maybe they would actually be able to pull this stunt off. A shiver of unease passed through him as a wave of haki pulsed from the pirate's slim form. Ace watched in awe as all the bodies on the larger ships dropped and their weapons clattered against the decks. The ocean was silent again as they passed through the colossal gates. Son of a bitch, Ace breathed in awe, grinning. From beside him, Mugiwara chuckled, his hand on top of his straw hat. Okay, sadly the chapter is over. And if you enjoyed the video, just leave a like and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.